Hey everyone, this is a chapter from Ian Birchall's book, Tony Cliff, a Marxist for His Time. This is a very large book, and I'm probably not going to read most of it because it's kind of beyond the scope of what I'm researching now, which is critical perspectives on the USSR within the Trotskyist milieu. And as some of you probably know, Tony Cliff was one of the major exponents within that milieu of a state capitalist theory of the USSR. And when I was looking through this book earlier, doing like keyword searches and stuff, it seems like the most of the meat of Birchall's analysis and explanation of Cliff's theory of state capitalism in the USSR is to be found in this chapter. So, that's why I am reading this. So, the journey across the Mediterranean lasted about a week. Did I say the chapter title already? It's the chapter's titled 1946 to 1950 in a Strange Land. The journey across the Mediterranean lasted about a week. Cliff and Chaney could not afford a cabin, so they traveled on the deck. The boat stopped in Italy, then continued to Marseille, where they disembarked. From here they took a pack train to Paris, where they stayed for about 3 weeks, living with relatives of Cliff's. It was just 2 years since the liberation, and life was dominated by austerity and shortages. Their hosts were very poor with a young child. They had no milk, no coffee, nothing but the barest necessities. The Communist Party was in government and putting a brake on all working-class resistance. Cliff and Chaney found Paris a beautiful city. Cliff's glasses had fallen into the sea during the journey, and he was unable to fully appreciate a visit to the Folie Bergère. I don't know if that's what the hell that is, but it's not my best guess at pronouncing it. I don't know what that is. I'll look it up real quick. Just for fun. Just for funsies. Okay. It's an opera house, okay, in Paris. Back to the text. In Palestine, Cliff and Chaney had been told that there was an acute shortage of razor blades in France, so they had spent what little money they had on blades, hoping to sell them at a profit. Sadly, razor blades were one of the few items not in short supply, and they were unable to supplement their meager funds. The main reason for coming to Paris was to meet the leadership of the Fourth International. For 10 hard years, Cliff had been sustained by the ideas of Trotskyism, while maintaining only tenuous organizational contacts. Now at last, Cliff was setting foot in the family home. Unfortunately, the experience was to be something of a disappointment. Cliff and Chaney went to meet Sam Gordon, the representative of the American Socialist Workers Party in Europe, who was assisting with the post-liberation reorganization of the Fourth International. There's no immediate bio coming up for Sam Gordon. The newcomers were immediately struck by an element of pretentiousness in Gordon's approach. When they arrived, he was typing and continued to do so for a couple of hours, ignoring his visitors. He was a busy man, perhaps he had a deadline to meet, but they could not help feeling that he was trying to create an impression. When he did find time to speak to them, he talked about his intention to get equipment for simultaneous translation, something of an unnecessary luxury given the small size of the International. As yet, they had no idea of the political reasons behind these trivial symptoms. Cliff also had his first encounter with Ernest Mandel, whom he would have a number of brushes in the future. On the 25th of September 1946, Cliff and Chaney arrived at Dover. Cliff was permitted to enter Britain on condition that he did not remain more than 3 months. They traveled to London, another city recovering from war. There were still numerous bomb sites throughout the capital. To add insult to injury, the winter of 1946 to 47 will be one of the most severe on record, with power cuts and factories closed. For Cliff and Chaney, who had left behind the sunshine of Palestine, it was a terrible shock. Chaney had no suitable clothing for such harsh weather. This was the heart of the British Empire under which Cliff had suffered in Palestine. On many thousands of living room walls throughout Britain there were still maps of the world, with the countries of the British Empire marked in red. That empire was now condemned to death. Over the coming decades, British society would go through some startling changes, though scarcely those which revolutionary socialists hoped for. Cliff was impressed by working-class living standards in Britain. Partly, this was simply the contrast between a colonial territory and the metropolitan country. But it was also a recognition that capitalism was not in total decay, that it was able to offer real reforms to workers. Cliff quickly observed that unlike the Arab children he remembered from Palestine, in England even the poorest children had shoes. As he would soon have learnt, under the Labour government all children got free orange juice. Many years later he recalled, quote, "Another thing hit me between the eyes at the time. The standard of living for workers in Britain was high. When I first visited a worker's house, just an ordinary house, I asked his job and he was an engineer. My English wasn't very good, so I thought he meant an engineer with a degree, but he was a semi-skilled engineering worker. It was a complete shock. Children were better off than in the 30s. The only time I saw children without shoes in Europe was in Dublin. Children didn't get rickets anymore. It helped me to realize that the final crisis wasn't around the corner," end quote. Cliff and Chaney were welcomed by the British Trotskyists. On the arrival, they were given temporary accommodation by Charles Van Gelderen and his wife. Accommodation which their host thought was somewhat cramped, but which they found luxurious, though the bed was very small. One second. Sorry, one second. I have a different copy of this PDF than I do right here, and I want to see if it has footnotes. Because the one I'm reading right now is kind of... One second. So I'm sorry, then it's fucking annoying. I feel like I'm missing stuff by reading it this way. Fuck it, there's no footnotes. I'm just skipping footnotes. Sorry about that. It says that Charlie Van Gelderen, who lived from August 1913 to October 2001, was a South African Trotskyist active in the British Labour movement from the 1930s. Charlie Van Gelderen attended the founding conference of the Fourth International in 1938, and towards the end of his life, he was the last survivor of that conference. In the 1940s, Charlie Van Gelderen played the leading role for the Revolutionary Communist Party's fraction in the Labour Party. Van Gelderen became leader of the International Marxist Group and served on the editorial board of its magazine International. After the breakup of the International Marxist Group, Charlie van Gelderen joined the International Socialist Group. Okay, back to the text. Sorry, let me reread that last sentence. On arrival, they were given temporary accommodation by Charles van Gelderen and his wife, accommodation which their host thought was somewhat cramped, but which they found luxurious, though the bed was very small. Van Gelderen was under close state surveillance, with his mail being opened, because of his activities in the army and his contacts with the Italian Trotskyists. When they got accommodations of their own, they were victims of the slum landlords of northeast London in a dwelling infested with rats, lice, and bugs. Channy soon found work as a teacher, a profession in which she was to stay for the rest of her life. Although her only qualification was a degree in Hebrew from a South African university, this sufficed to get her a job, although the school was in Kent, which meant an early morning start and a long journey. Channy was put in charge of teaching infants, which she had no training or experience. But Channy soon mastered the required skills and became a very good infant teacher. Still, Channy found time to put Cliff's work into English and type it up. Cliff's most pressing problem was the right to stay in Britain. With his papers and his South African wife, he had got into the country. Staying there was more difficult. For assistance, he turned to the Independent Labour Party, with whom he had contacts back in the days of the Marxist circles. Sheila Leslie, a member of the Revolutionary Communist Party who worked at the offices of the Independent Labour Party weekly paper in Finchley, remembered Cliff and another Palestinian coming to ask for assistance. He seemed terribly clever, but, quote, like a good gossip, end quote. Cliff had a friendly manner, but he doubtless hoped to absorb as much information as possible about his new environment. Although now in severe decline, the Independent Labour Party still had members of Parliament, though in 1948 the Independent Labour Party would rejoin the Labour Party. Cliff contacted Campbell Stephen, one of the two Independent Labour Party MPs who had visited Palestine in 1938. Stephen, a former clergyman, gave Cliff a lecture on the historic mission of the Jewish people, but he did arrange for Cliff to stay in the country, at least temporarily. The requirement was that Cliff had to report once a month to Stephen. It says that Campbell Stephen was a Scottish socialist politician, a native of Glasgow. One second. He was educated at Townhead Public School, Allen Glen School, and Glasgow University. Campbell Stephen worked first as United Free Church minister and then as a barrister. He resigned his charge at the United Free Church in Ardrossan, Ayrshire, in 1918 to contest Eyre Burrs in the same year. Campbell Stephen was Independent Labour Party Member of Parliament for Glasgow Camlachie from November 1922 to 1931 and from 1935 until his death. Campbell Stephen was one of James Maxton's closest political allies within the Independent Labour Party and supported Maxton both in his attempts to foster closer relations with the Communist Party and also the disaffiliation debate in the early 1930s. Despite his strong support for Independent Labour Party independence from the Labour Party when Maxton was alive, Stephen resigned the Independent Labour Party whip to sit as an independent from July 1947 and rejoined the Labour Party in October, shortly before his death. Stephen's death sparked the 1948 Glasgow Camlachie by-election. In 1945, Campbell Stephen married Dorothy Jewson, a former Labour member of Parliament for Norwich. Back to the text. This was only a stopgap arrangement. Cliff was determined not to return to Palestine. As the foundation of the State of Israel came closer, the prospects of doing any political work there became minimal. He attempted to find a university place in Europe. France was his first preference, and he was accepted by 17 French universities. Channy went to France, where she had a long telephone conversation with a French government official, but was subsequently told, quote, "Your husband will never come to France," end quote. He considered Denmark and even Spain. For most people, the problems of adapting to a new culture and getting right of residency would have been a full-time preoccupation. But for Cliff, everything was subordinated to the political tasks. At last, he would be able to participate in the Fourth International in the heartland of imperialism. Unfortunately, the Fourth International was facing problems even more intractable than Cliff's domestic difficulties. From the 1920s onward, Leon Trotsky had fought implacably against Stalin's corruption of the Russian Revolution. He had been hounded from one country to another and was murdered in 1940. Trotsky's followers took up the struggle with enormous courage despite their tiny numbers. The Second World War was Trotskyism's finest hour. Almost alone, the Trotskyists preserved the internationalist tradition, while Social Democrats backed the war uncritically, and Stalinists engaged in the most grotesque forms of nationalism. In France, Trotskyists produced a publication in German in order to fraternize with German soldiers. At the end of the war, things were more complicated. Trotsky had bequeathed to his followers the basic socialist principles that had animated all that was best in the Russian Revolution. He had also bequeathed some false predictions. First, Trotsky had believed that the regime in Stalin's Russia, quote, degenerated worker state, end quote, as Trotsky called the regime in Stalin's Russia, was fundamentally unstable and unlikely to survive long. Quote, "A sphere balanced on the point of a pyramid must invariably roll down one side or the other," end quote. Secondly, Trotsky believed that capitalism was in such deep crisis that it had exhausted its capacity for reforms, and as a result, reformist politics, in either a social democratic or a Stalinist form, had no further possibility of development and would vanish. In July 1939, he specifically predicted the imminent disappearance of the British and French Social Democrats and Stalinist leaders. Quote, "Attlee and Pollitt, Blum and Thérèse work in the same harness. In the case of war, the last remaining distinctions between them will vanish. All of them, together with bourgeois society as a whole, will be crushed under the wheel of history," end quote. Attlee was the head of the Labour government in the early post-war era. Pollitt, I believe, was the head of the Communist Party of Great Britain. Blum was the leader of the Popular Front government in France, and Thérèse was the leader of the Communist Party of France. By 1945, it was already clear that Stalinism had emerged from the war enormously strengthened, able to take most of Eastern Europe under its direct control and in a position to negotiate on equal terms with Britain and the United States. In Western Europe, reformism, far from having vanished, was very much alive. In almost every country, communists and social democrats formed the backbone of the post-war governments. In his early years, Trotsky, with the theory of permanent revolution, had been an important original thinker in the Marxist tradition. When Stalinism forced Trotsky into isolated opposition, Trotsky was pushed onto the defensive, obliged to stress his Leninist orthodoxy. Trotsky's beleaguered followers were forced into an even more defensive role. Stalinist parties with many times more members spread lies and slanders about them, accused them of being, quote, Hitler's agents, end quote, and used physical violence, even murder, against them. This defensiveness was all too understandable, but its consequences were nonetheless pernicious. Trotsky's analysis of a world in deep crisis, which had been realistic enough at the time they were made, did not fit the unexpected realities of the post-war situation. There were two main problems. Firstly, Trotskyists expected that the Second World War, like the First, would be followed by a major economic and social upheaval offering immense possibilities to revolutionaries. The end of the war did see brief revolutionary upsurges, for example in Italy, Greece, and Vietnam. But these were limited in scope, and the economic catastrophe did not take place. As time went by, revolutionaries had to ask whether it had merely been temporarily delayed, or whether the whole perspective on modern capitalism needed revision. This was linked to what may be called the, quote, Zimmerwald syndrome, end quote. In 1915, a group of fewer than 40 anti-war activists gathered in the Swiss village of Zimmerwald in total isolation from the European labor movement. Just over 2 years later, two of the participants, Lenin and Trotsky, were in power in Russia. This episode provided a powerful inspiration for revolutionaries, reminding them of the possibilities waiting to be seized. But it also encouraged sectarianism, encouraging small groups to overestimate their own importance because they might soon be leading masses of workers. But an even dilemma was posed by events in Eastern Europe. Trotsky had insisted until the day of his death that Stalin's Russia, despite its monstrous bureaucratic perversion of socialist principles, retained the economic structures of a, quote, workers' state, end quote. Following the post-war carve-up of the world into spheres of influence, Russia took over most of Eastern Europe, and soon new economies were being established that closely followed the Russian model. The initial response of the Fourth International was that since these new regimes did not owe their origin to the self-activity of workers, they could not be considered workers' states. But as time went on, the anomaly of states existing side by side, almost identical in their in their economic functioning, but one labeled a, quote, workers' state, end quote, while the others remained capitalist, posed increasingly awkward questions. Toward the end of his life, Cliff revisited the debates of the 1940s in a little book called Trotskyism After Trotsky. It is striking that in describing the period, Cliff used the words, quote, excruciatingly painful, end quote. In retrospect, it is easy to make fun of some of the intellectual contortions that Trotskyists went through at this time, but they were grappling with a profoundly difficult situation. This was a generation that had already faced up to the fact that, when reaction and fascism were sweeping the West, they could not look for salvation from the East. To recognize that Trotsky too might be an unreliable guide must have been an almost unbearable prospect. The leaders of the Fourth International were tough people who had lived through tough times. James Buchanan had been jailed for sedition during the Second World War. Ernest Mandel had twice been imprisoned during the Nazi occupation of Belgium. Michel Pablo had organized the Fourth International clandestinely in Nazi-occupied France. Their revolutionary integrity was not in doubt. The problem was analysis. The Revolutionary Communist Party, which Cliff joined immediately on arrival in Britain, was one of the best sections of the Fourth International. Formed in March 1944 by a merger of two rival organizations. Trotskyists had played a very creditable role during the war, backing strikes opposed by the pro-war Communist Party. They faced government repression. The Revolutionary Communist Party members were put on trial and imprisoned. Its membership was small, falling from 363 in 1946 to 336 in 1947, but dedicated and largely working class. The full-time general secretary was Jock Haston. 1 second. I'll look him up. The full-time general secretary was Jock Haston. As an organizer, public speaker, and theoretician, Jock Haston was the leading figure in the Revolutionary Communist Party. Two other important members were Ted Grant and Jerry Healy. Both of whom would play a notable role in British Trotskyism over the coming decades. Wikipedia says, James, quote, Jock, and, quote, Richie Haston lived from 1913 to 1986, and was a Trotskyist politician and general secretary of the Revolutionary Communist Party in Great Britain. Two other important members were Ted Grant and Jerry Haley, both of whom would play a notable role in British Trotskyism over the coming decades. The fact that the Revolutionary Communist Party did have some small base in the working class movement helps to explain the fact that it was largely in disagreement with the economic perspectives of the International. Whereas the Fourth International leadership denied the possibility of a post-war boom, the majority of the British section recognized that in the short term, capitalism had been able to, quote, gain a new breathing space, end quote, though nobody could yet imagine just how long the post-war boom would be. A minority headed by Healy argued that, quote, British capitalism is on the edge of an abyss, end quote. The argument was not purely speculative. It concerned how the Revolutionary Communist Party should organize in the coming years. In the 1930s, British Trotskyists had worked inside the Independent Labour Party, then the Labour Party, a tactic often known as, quote, entrism, end quote. But during the war period, entrism would have little meaning, since the Labour Party branches scarcely functioned. So since its formation, the Revolutionary Communist Party had operated more or less legally as an open party. In 1945, it had contested not very successfully a by-election in South Wales. In peacetime, with a Labour government in power and millions of workers looking to it with considerable hope, the situation was very different. The Healy minority advocated Labour Party entry, arguing that the, quote, cadres of the future Revolutionary Party would be drawn from the most advanced political elements in the capital L Labour movement, end quote. Cliff was already known by reputation to Jock Haston and the other leaders of the Revolutionary Communist Party. He was rapidly welcomed into the party and was promptly invited to attend meetings of the Political Bureau. His pamphlet, The Middle East at the Crossroads, had been widely circulated in the International, and his reputation as a theoretician had preceded him. Cliff was a studious and careful researcher, good with masses of empirical material, and with the ever-reliable assistance of Chaney, a prolific writer. Cliff also, despite language difficulties, began to develop as a speaker. Ray Challinor heard him address a meeting in Staines in 1947 on the current situation in France. Despite his difficulties with English, he gave an exposition of the tactics of the French Communist Party since their ejection from government. Cliff also had experience of clandestine activity. He was shocked to discover that revolutionary literature was being posted to Czechoslovakia through the open mail, exposing its recipients to repression. Cliff enjoyed good relations with his comrades and became particularly friendly with Jock Haston. Yet because Cliff was a, quote, outsider, end quote, he did not have ties of personal loyalty or friendship which might have inhibited him from engaging in vigorous disputes. At the age of 30, Cliff was at the height of his powers. In Britain, he was at the heart of the debates in the Trotskyist movement and was able to develop his intellectual capacity far more rapidly than had been possible in the isolation of Palestine. Given the need to adapt to an unfamiliar environment and his problems in trying to remain in that country, his productivity during his first years in Britain was extraordinary. Although sections of the ruling class still thought Britain could hang on to its traditional imperial role, it was becoming apparent that the British Empire was doomed. The independence of India in 1947 was a vital turning point, though the problem of post-colonialism, national liberation, and the, quote, third world, end quote, were still in the future. As a recent citizen of a colonial territory, Cliff had a particular interest in the question, and in 1947 Cliff wrote 3 substantial articles on the development of imperialism. The first 2 drew on the work he had done in the Middle East, the world struggle for oil, the peace world struggle for oil, noted 2 important trends which would shape the world economy in the coming years: the growing economic importance of the Middle East as a source of oil and the decline of British imperialism in relation to the United States. While U.S. imperialism faced serious problems, it had a strategy for overcoming them, end quote. Quote, the great development of American capitalism has deepened manyfold the contradictions within it, and the capitalists will try to overcome them by imperialist expansion on a terrific scale, end quote. Cliff. The article dealt with Russian ambitions in the Middle East, noting, quote, the Stalinist bureaucracy tries to get over its difficulties, the result of bureaucratic mismanagement, in a simple way by gaining control of rich new fields, end quote. In his analysis, Cliff did not differentiate between the, quote, great powers, end quote, maintaining that, quote, the toilers of the Middle East cannot rely on any of the great powers. The toilers of the Middle East can only rely on themselves, on their own strength, and on the help of the millions of fighters for national and social independence of the East and the working class of the West. End quote. In the struggle for oil, Cliff perceived, quote, the seeds of a new world order, end quote. Three months later came a piece titled Some Features of Capitalist Economy in the Colonies. Here Cliff focused on the Egyptian example, drawing heavily on his earlier research and including a good deal of statistical material. Cliff drew out in particular the fact that the role of the state was changing in modern capitalism. Quote, the capitalist magnate of the 20th century has no cause to fear the state bureaucracy. The capitalist magnate's strength is sufficient for him to negotiate with the ministers as the representative of a power on an equal footing with the state. And not only this, he even desires the state's increasing intervention in foreign affairs by a policy of imperialist expansion, wars, etc., and also in domestic affairs, having a, quote, strong hand, end quote, against the proletariat, end quote. The analysis was predicated on the view that this was a period of, quote, decaying, agonizing capitalism, end quote. Hence Cliff argued, quote, not only is the world economy in its entirety ripe for socialism, but the most important colonies, e.g. Egypt, India, China, are ripe for the socialist revolution in themselves, end quote. Cliff. All this provided, quote, new confirmation of the theory of the permanent revolution, end quote. Within a few years, Egypt would see a revolution of a very different type from what Cliff envisaged. There would be much rethinking ahead. The most important article, published in early 1947, was Conflict in India. Cliff had never visited India, nor had he studied the subject previously, but Cliff was drawing on his Palestinian experience and in particular his knowledge of Muslim organizations. Cliff remained skeptical about whether Britain was capable of giving full independence to India, a skepticism justified by the fact that the Attlee government had no clear strategy for India and would be forced by circumstances into a botched and disastrous partition. Quote, and so, to the platitude of the Labour government that they want to give independence, but the Indians are not capable of ruling themselves and will cut one another's throats in communal clashes, we must answer that the occupation army has not yet left India, that the pillars of imperialist rule, the princes, zamindars, etc., are still in the saddle, and without their eradication, the independence of India can only be a fiction. As a result, end quote. As a result, quote, the British workers must understand that Attlee's freedom for India is only a faked freedom. They must struggle for the evacuation of the British Army from India, for an end to the economic control of British imperialism over the key industries of the country, for the liquidation of the British civil service, for an end to British government support for the princes and feudal leaders, and its opposition to universal franchise, end quote. Cliff quite correctly applied the theory of permanent revolution to show that the role of the Indian Congress was limited. Quote, that Congress will not lead any real struggle against the large land owners is evident from the capitalist social character of its leadership, end quote. But he was still too attached to orthodox Leninism to envisage the new direction in which imperialism was to develop. The most interesting part of the article was Cliff's consideration on the eve of partition of the relation between Hindus and Muslims. Cliff argued that the Stalinists were quite wrong to see Muslims as a nation. On the contrary, it was imperialism which had given rise to the conflicts between Muslims and Hindus. Quote, The power mainly responsible for communal clashes is British imperialism. The British rulers put Hindus to rule over Muslim peasants and vice versa, thus sowing the seeds of communal discord. End quote. Cliff gave various concrete examples of how communal conflict had class roots. In Punjab, the usurers were mainly Hindus, while most poor peasants were Muslims. Competition among clerks took on a communal form because imperialism had denied Muslims education. Hence, he concluded, quote, only the class struggle of the workers, Hindu and Muslim alike, can build real unity and overcome all communal differences, end quote. He pointed the way to a different future for the subcontinent. Cliff was entrusted with the task of defending the economic perspectives of the RCP against the International Secretariat of the Fourth International. Cliff's article, All That Glitters Is Not Gold, was published in the autumn of 1947. It was a reply to a document called From the ABC to Current Reading, Boom, Revival, or Crisis by Ernest Germain, who is Ernest Mandel. Oh, it says here. Germain was the pseudonym of Ernest Mandel, who, as well as being a leading figure in the Fourth International, was later to become a distinguished professor of economics. He insisted that, quote, in the period of capitalist decadence, the British industry can no longer overgrow the state of revival and attain one of real boom, ... The situation of the British economy is not that of a boom, if one wishes to give this term the significance that Marxists have always given to it, end quote. In this article, Cliff revealed a new talent, one he might well have preferred not to discover, the art of internal polemic. In Cliff's earlier writings, he had shown anger against the economic system or against political enemies such as the Stalinists. Now his venom was directed against members of his own organization. He was beginning to realize just how profound the crisis of Trotskyism was becoming. Cliff was taking on a fairly easy target. An editorial in Fourth International had claimed that, quote, the prospects in England are dimmer and dimmer for a return to the living levels of 1939, let alone the levels achieved before 1914, end quote. Cliff needed merely to stroll through the streets of London and chat to a few older members of the Revolutionary Communist Party to know that this was false. Likewise, when Germain wrote that, quote, far from being a result of the boom, the coal shortage is a factor in limiting the revival and making its development towards a boom impossible, end quote. Cliff needed only to point out that consumption of coal in British industry was higher than it had ever been. Cliff was not particularly given to pedantry and academic point scoring. Here, however, he took a certain malicious glee in pointing out Germain's, quote, most elementary mistakes, end quote, and his, quote, gross lack of knowledge of the Marxist theory of crises, end quote. Cliff pointed out that Mandel had misquoted Marx's account of the economic cycle. Generously, he attributed this to carelessness and not to conscious falsification. He concluded, quote, one could go on pulling the weeds out of Germain's garden, but I am afraid that were this to be done, nothing would remain at all, end quote. By using extensive empirical material taken from The Economist and elsewhere, where Germain had given little factual evidence in support of his position, Cliff had no difficulty in demonstrating his conclusion, quote, the British majority are right, there is a boom in Britain, end quote. A number of interesting observations were made in the course of the argument in response to a claim by Pablo that British production relative to before the war must have fallen because the level of imports of raw materials had fallen. Cliff pointed out that the shift from textiles to engineering had relatively decreased the dependence on foreign sources of raw material. The role of raw materials would be a significant point in the analysis of the changing nature of imperialism made by Cliff's comrade, Mike Kidron, K-I-D-R-O-N, Kidron, a decade or more later. Secondly, when Germain wrote that, quote, the number of active men has declined by 211,000 in relation to 1939, end quote, Cliff was able to respond that the number of active women had risen by 671,000. As he'd also noted, about 1 million women had left employment after the end of the war. At the time, it was fairly normal for socialists to think of the working class as consisting of male workers with wives and children. While Cliff's one remark does not make him a pioneer of feminism, it does show he was aware of significant changes in the nature of the labor force. But while Cliff had little difficulty in proving his point, the article was still a halfway house. He had no doubt that there was a boom in Britain in 1947, but he hastened to qualify this by saying that while there was, quote, a possibility of certain reforms or semi-reforms being introduced, these reforms cannot be of a general and lasting nature, end quote. Cliff still believed that crisis lay in the near future, even if temporarily postponed. In an article on the Marshall Plan in October 1947, Cliff predicted that the, quote, catastrophic outbreak of the contradiction between U.S. productive capacity and the internal market, end quote, could be postponed, quote, for but a few years at most, end quote. While he noted the impact of the massive military budget, he described it as, quote, but a palliative, end quote, and argued that only the export of capital offered the U.S. a means to, quote, postpone the explosion of her inner contradictions, end quote. The idea of a boom that would last a full quarter of a century was well beyond Cliff's horizon. In the course of Cliff's argument, Cliff cited Lenin's imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, to the effect that the decay of capitalism did not preclude the possibility of rapid growth. Cliff also cited Trotsky's transitional program, which argued that in the, quote, epoch of decaying capitalism, there can be no discussion of the systematic social reforms and the raising of the masses, end quote. The raising of the masses' living standards, Every serious demand of the proletariat inevitably reaches beyond the limits of capitalist property relations and of the bourgeois state, end quote. He merely argued that this should not be interpreted, quote, mechanically, end quote. Over the coming years, events would force Cliff to turn back to these two classic texts and make a much more radical criticism of them. The question which dominated Cliff's thinking in 1947 and which would become his major contribution to Marxist theory was the class nature of Russia. The question was one of considerable importance. The consolidation of Stalinist rule in Eastern Europe and the beginning of the Cold War meant that a new world conflict was possible in the near future. The, quote, defense of the Soviet Union, end quote, advocated by Trotsky might become a very practical question. In such a situation, the position that Russia was a workers' state but that Poland and Hungary were not would become utterly untenable. Although Cliff had apparently given some thought into the Russian question while still in Palestine, and on arrival in Britain he was firmly committed to Trotskyist orthodoxy. Charles van Gelderen recalled him saying shortly after arrival in Britain, quote, the old man, Trotsky, is not yet cold in his grave, and already they want to renege on his teachings, I will destroy them, end quote. In August 1946, just before Cliff's arrival, Haston had circulated an internal document in which Haston argued that Russia had, quote, both capitalistic and socialistic features, end quote. While Haston claimed that this was merely a restatement of Trotskyist orthodoxy, his opponents, including Healy, accused him of heresy. In fact, Haston did go so far as to argue that, quote, out of the ranks of the bureaucracy there is being exuded a new possessing class, end quote, and that, quote, there is no reason why a new capitalist in Russia cannot arise and dominate the economic life of the country without destroying state property as such, end quote. There was considerable discussion in the Revolutionary Communist Party, with some comrades following Shachtman's position that Russia was neither capitalist nor a workers' state, while others denied that Russia was a workers' state without giving it, quote, any final nomenclature, end quote. The argument extended beyond the, quote, Russian question, end quote, to take in the whole problem of the labor government, which was carrying through a program of nationalization far more radical than many had believed possible. As Jock Haston moved further towards a, quote, state capitalist position, the internal executive of the Fourth International put up Cliff to defend the orthodox, quote, workers' state, end quote, argument. Cliff had a number of discussions with Jock Haston and Ted Grant in which he defended the workers' state theory. It just says Grant, but I believe it's Ted Grant. Cliff toiled hard at empirical work on the economic situation in Russia, producing a series of articles for the Revolutionary Communist Party press. As Cliff worked, the realities of Russian society increasingly came into contradiction with the model he was trying to impose on them. For a while, Cliff struggled to resolve the contradiction, but eventually it was too much for him. One morning, Cliff awoke and informed Chaney that, quote, Russia is not a workers' state, but state capitalist, end quote. Chaney, who had a long journey to work ahead of her, may well have felt that this was not the most urgent piece of information he could have given her. Many years later, Cliff remembered the intellectual torment of that time where he had to decide what was essential in Marxism and what had to be abandoned. Quote, the more convinced you are about basic Marxist ideas, the more you are ready to throw overboard things that are secondary to those basic ideas. If you are really convinced of your ideas, you can face reality. But it was a very difficult period. For more than a month, I hadn't slept in the transition from the old theory to the new, end quote. Cliff. In reading Cliff's writings from the time, the wealth of concrete examples and constant references to Marxist classics, it is easy to drown in detail. Many years later, Cliff summed up what it was that had compelled him to change his mind. Quote, when I came to the theory of state capitalism, I didn't come to the theory of state capitalism by a long analysis of the law of value in Russia, the economic statistics in Russia, nothing of the sort. I came to the theory of state capitalism by the simple statement that if the emancipation of the working class is the act of the working class, then you cannot have a workers' state without the workers having power to dictate what happens in society. So I had to choose between what Trotsky said, the heart of Trotsky is the self-activity of the workers, or the form of property. I decided to push away the form of property as the determining question, end quote. Just to be clear, there's nothing in that last statement that would distinguish state capitalism theory from bureaucratic collectivism theory at this point. Let's see why Cliff disagrees with that. Cliff was far from the first to use the concept of state capitalism. The idea and term had a long history in the socialist movement. To understand the significance and the originality of Cliff's work, it may be useful to briefly trace the history of the theory. In Anti-Düring, Friedrich Engels had discussed the role of state ownership in a capitalist economy and had concluded that in itself state ownership had nothing to do with socialism. Quote, the modern state, no matter what its form, is essentially a capitalist machine. The state of the capitalist, the ideal personification of the total national capital. The more it proceeds to the taking over of productive forces, the more does it actually become the national capitalist. The more citizens does the state exploit. The workers remain wage workers, proletarians, end quote. Friedrich Engels, Anti-Düring. Before 1917, the term, quote, state capitalism, end quote, was sometimes used to indicate a traditional capitalist society in which the state made substantial interventions in the economy. One such account was given in William English Walling's Socialism as It Is, with particular reference to the policies of the British Liberal government of 1906. It says that William English Walling was an American labor reformer. William English Walling lived from 1877 to 1936. Known as, quote, English, end quote, to friends and family, was an American labor reformer and socialist Republican born into a wealthy family in Louisville, Kentucky. William English Walling founded the National Woman's Trade Union League in 1903, moved by his investigation of the Springfield race riot of 1908 in the state capital of Illinois. He was among the co-founders of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP. In 1909, he wrote 3 books on socialism in the 20th century. He left the Socialist Party because of its anti-war policy, as he believed the United States' participation in the Great War was needed to defeat the Central Powers. This is of some significance because Walling was a major influence on Louis Corey, whose Decline of American Capitalism Cliff had translated into Hebrew. I believe Louis Corey was an initial American communist. Yeah, Louis C. Freyna. Louis C. Freyna lived from 1892 to 1953 and was a founding member of the Communist Party USA in 1919. After running afoul of the Communist International in 1921 over the alleged misappropriation of funds, Freyna left the organized radical movement, emerging in 1926 as a left-wing public intellectual by the name of Louis Corey. During the McCarthy era, deportation proceedings were initiated against Freyna Corey. After a protracted legal battle, Corey died of a cerebral hemorrhage before the action against him was formally abandoned. Back to the text. When the Bolsheviks took power in 1917, there was immediately widespread debate among both their friends and their critics about the nature of the new regime that had been established. Many, quote, orthodox and, quote, Marxists argued that the Bolshevik Revolution had been premature, that the material conditions for building socialism did not yet exist, and that therefore the regime could not go beyond the limits of a new form of capitalism. This was the position held by Karl Kautsky, known before 1914 as the, quote, Pope of Marxism, end quote, who polemicized with both Lenin and Trotsky on the question. In his 1919 pamphlet, Terrorism and Communism, to which Trotsky replied in a work of the same name, Kautsky argued that since post-revolutionary Russia would not be a highly developed industrial society, quote, industrial capitalism has been transformed from a private to a state capitalism, end quote. The leading Austro-Marxist theoretician Otto Bauer likewise argued that the Russian Revolution could not go beyond bourgeois limits. In the 1830s, Bauer, working in the same mechanical framework, defended Stalinism as a historical necessity. A similar position was held by some Mensheviks, although a variety of views developed in Menshevik circles. All these positions could be said to represent a right-wing critique of Bolshevism, arguing that Lenin had tried to go too far too fast and that a more gradualist approach would have been preferable. In the early 1920s, similar positions emerged among, quote, left, end quote, critics of the Bolsheviks. It's important to note, for me, just as a side note, it's important to me that to my understanding, absolutely it would be the case that what the Mensheviks, or not the Mensheviks, but what these people like Kautsky and Bauer would be saying is absolutely true, and I think conceded as such by people like Trotsky, even though they wouldn't quite phrase it this way, after the fact, right? So the idea is that there would be a revolution in Russia that would be complemented and supplemented by a revolution in the West, and that didn't come to pass. And the idea that there would be Russia would be able to move into a socialist direction on its own was in some sense viewed as a pipe dream. But to my understanding, the Bolsheviks didn't have the intention of their revolution being like a national revolution, right? So it's kind of like, why does capitalism, when people, or like if you read like Revolution Betrayed, for instance, at least this is why I got it, like a huge parts of the book have this kind of like objective explanation for the rise of the bureaucracy, right? Kind of like nothing to do with like the subjective intentions of the bureaucracy. The thing is like, there's the famous breadline thing where it's like, the bureaucracy must be there or is there because as a consequence of the scarcity and dearth that is present in the Soviet Union, and the bureaucracy kind of oversees the limited arbitrates property disputes, basically, about limited wealth. Basically, sorry, I'm not prepared to stuff. Basically, the idea was that in that book is that Russia was inadequately developed to be have a non-bureaucratically deformed worker state. I mean, obviously he doesn't think that because it contradicts with this whole thing of like saying that like, you know, the worker state or whatever can be revived. But it seems like a lot of people, you know, Russia was right for communism, and then if it doesn't go well, it's because it wasn't right for communism. Anyway, I'm just talking. What was particularly the case with a group of this was particularly the case. Sorry, let me reread the last sentence before I trot off. In the early 1920s, similar positions emerged among, quote, left, end quote, critics of the Bolsheviks. I like how he puts, he doesn't put right-wing in quotation marks when he's talking about the Mensheviks, but he puts, quote, left critics around, puts quotation marks around these left critics of Bolsheviks. This was particularly the case with a group of thinkers associated with the Communist Workers Party of Germany, the KAPD, formed in 1920 by those expelled for ultra-leftism from the German Communist Party. Leading figures included Hermann Gorder, Anton Pannekoek, and Otto Rühle. Initially, they had been enthusiastic about the revolution, but they soon developed reservations, believing that the objective conditions for socialist revolution did not yet exist in Russia. In an article of October 1920, Rühle argued that Bolshevik centralism belonged to the age of bourgeois revolution. Yet from this analysis of the differences between East and West, they derived an ultra-left strategy for their own country. Pannekoek argued that the influence of bourgeois ideas on the working class was much stronger in Western Europe than in Russia, and therefore it was necessary to attack bourgeois institutions in which the workers still put their trust, such as parliament and trade unions. The Socialist Party of Great Britain, an organization devoted entirely to propagandism, showed some initial sympathy for the Bolsheviks, but soon argued that the new regime could not be socialist and therefore still be capitalist, although it occasionally expressed admiration for Lenin. Hence, the idea that the Russian Revolution had led to capitalism in a somewhat different form was associated from the beginning with critics of Leninism, whether from left or right. This explains why the argument was regarded with such hostility in Trotskyist circles. Inside Russia, the stakes were much higher. The nature of the new regime became a matter of life and death. Sorry, just looking at the thing here. I'm going to look someone up. So Wikipedia for Valerian Obolensky, who lived from 1887 to 1938, who worked under the party pseudonym Nikolai Osinsky, was a Russian Bolshevik revolutionary, Marxist theorist, Soviet politician, economist, and professor of the Agricultural Academy of Moscow. Back to the text. In April 1918, just 6 months after the revolution, V.V. Osinsky, a revolutionary militant since 1907, warned that managerial authority and the use of bourgeois specialists could lead the revolution in the wrong direction. Quote, socialism and socialist organization must be set up by the proletariat itself, or they will not be set up at all. Something else will be set up, state capitalism. End quote. In 1919, Osinsky, together with T.V. Sopronov and others, formed the Democratic Centralism faction. In this period, Lenin himself used the term, quote, state capitalism, end quote, to refer to something which he believed could be reconciled with the dictatorship of the proletariat. He considered that in a transitional period between capitalism and socialism, state capitalism could be understood as private capitalism under the control of a worker state. Lenin saw this simply as a temporary retreat in the process of development towards socialism, not as a new form of society. After Lenin's death, Stalin proclaimed his theory of quote, socialism in one country, end quote, and what remained of socialist democracy was slowly strangled by an emerging bureaucratic layer. Various oppositional groupings began to emerge, and the idea of state capitalism again appeared. In 1925, one of Zinoviev's supporters, Zalutsky, wrote a pamphlet denouncing the state capitalism of the regime. So he's Pyotr Antonovich Zalutsky, lived from 1887 to 1937, was a Russian Bolshevik revolutionary and Communist Party organizer who was executed for his involvement in the United Opposition. So, in 1925, one of Zinoviev's supporters, Zalutsky, wrote a pamphlet denouncing the state capitalism of the regime. Zalutsky was removed from his post on the Leningrad Party Committee, and at the 14th Congress in 1925, Stalin spent some time repudiating the use of the term, quote, state capitalism, end quote. Initially, the Democratic centrists had worked with Trotsky, but in 1926, they broke with the United Opposition, arguing that it was necessary to form a new party. Trotsky and Zinoviev were both still convinced that it was possible to work for a reform within the Communist Party. Karl Radek was briefly sympathetic to this group, but Karl Radek found himself unable to accept the unthinkable conclusion that the whole revolution had been lost. When Radek contemplated the possibility and, as Radek put it, a precipice opened up before him, he decided to renounce the opposition. Sopronov, a militant since 1911, published a text denouncing the USSR's state capitalist system, where Asiatic despotism had destroyed proletarian democracy. There was no hope of reforming the party, and the working class must prepare for a struggle to the death against the regime and in defense of the fundamentals of Leninism. The term, quote, state capitalism, end quote, as used by democratic centralists was not accompanied by much analysis. They were putting a negative label on a repressive system rather than analyzing the laws of motion of a social system. As Robert Daniels points out, quote, they could only describe the strange impending evil in terms of dangers already familiar to them, end quote. Under Tsarism, the enemy had been capitalism, and they had fought it at the cost of great self-sacrifice. When a new enemy emerged, it was natural to give it the same name. Trotsky had little sympathy with the democratic centralists who had been his critics when he and Lenin were still in leadership. Trotsky considered their tactic of forming a new party to be dangerously ultra-left and dismissed their position as, quote, subjectivist, end quote, because they neglected the role of class relations and the workers' movement. In 1931, G.T. Myasnikov, a Bolshevik since 1906 who had moved to France in 1928, published a pamphlet in which he argued that Russian state capitalism involved exploitation and the production of surplus value. Quote, the whole of the state economy of the USSR represents, as it were, one large factory, in which an ordered cooperation and division of labor between different workplaces is present, end quote. After Trotsky's exile and the crushing of the left opposition, the debate about the nature of Stalin's regime continued. The question was argued vigorously in the jails and concentration camps, for Stalin's victims wanted to know exactly what force it was that had defeated them. Victor Serge, who experienced Stalin's repression, testifies to these debates in his novels. In the case of Comrade Tulyev, 3 men awaiting arrest and probable death disagree about whether their bodies will fertilize socialist soil, quote, socialist soil, end quote, or, quote, state capitalism. In Britain, the term was used quite widely by critics of the Stalinist system, including George Orwell, Walter Citrine, and Wyndham Lewis. I believe Walter Citrine was like a trade union organizer. I think wrote a big book on trade union tactics, I think. But I want to look up Wyndham Lewis. Percy Wyndham Lewis lived from 1882 to 1957 and was a British writer, painter, and critic. He was co-founder of the Vorticist movement in art and edited Blast, the literary magazine of the Vorticists. Lewis's novels include Tar, published in 1918, the Human Age trilogy composed of The Childermass, 1928, Monst Guy, 1950, 1955, and Malign Fiesta, 1955. A fourth volume titled The Trial of Man was unfinished at the time of his death. Lewis also wrote two autobiographical volumes, Blasting and Bombardiering, in 1937, and Rude Assignment, A Narrative of My Career Up to Date, published in 1950. The other thing I wanted to say is read the description of Victor Serge's The Case of Comrade Tuliev. It says, one cold Moscow night, Comrade Tuliev, a high government official, is shot dead on the street, and search for the killers begins. In this panoramic vision of the Soviet Great Terror, the investigation leads all over the world, netting a whole series of suspects whose only connection is their innocence, at least of the crime of which they stand accused. But the case of Comrade Tuliev, unquestionably the finest work of fiction ever written about the Stalinist purges, is not just a story of a totalitarian state, marked by the deep humanity and genius spirit of its author, the legendary anarchist in exile Victor Serge. The anarchist part is complicated, to say the least. It is also a classic 20th century tale of risk, adventure, and unexpected nobility, to set beside Ernest Hemingway's For Whom the Bell Tolls and Andre Malraux's Man's Fate. Back to the text. A pamphlet by a follower of Oswald Mosley identified communism with, quote, state capitalism, end quote, while commending Stalin for executing Jews. But the phrase was simply an insult, an assertion that Russia did not represent any advance on Western society. A new element was introduced into the debate in the early 1930s in the work of Lucien Larac, who argued that Russia, I think it's the pen name of Otto Menschel, I'm not sure if that's the right name, but pretty sure. He argued that Russia was neither capitalist nor socialist, but a, quote, new form of the exploitation of man by man, end quote. The surplus value received by the Soviet bureaucracy was described as an economic category which was, quote, totally different from capitalist surplus value, end quote. The position was taken up by Ivan Crépieux within the French Trotskyist movement and won the support of a third of the French section of the Fourth International. Crépieux and Trotsky debated publicly on the question in 1938. Later, a similar position was adopted by Bruno Rizzi and subsequently by Schachtman and his associates in 1938. In the U.S., not in 1938. The strength of the new analysis lay in the recognition that the society had emerged in post-Leninist Russia was something new and unprecedented. However, whereas Marx had devoted many hundreds of pages to analyzing the laws of motion of the capitalist system, the advocates of the view that Russia was a new form of society gave decidedly thinner accounts of how the new society functioned. The theory of state capitalism was taken further forward in 1939 by the Australian Ryan Worrall. Worrall argued firstly that it was theoretically possible to save capitalism without private ownership of property. To have capitalism without private ownership of property. And secondly, that the bureaucracy had the same function as the bourgeoisie in private capitalism, namely the accumulation of capital. Thirdly, he insisted that Russia could not be a workers' state since the bureaucracy was not under the democratic control of the working class. One reason why state capitalism tended to meet disfavor in the Trotskyist movement was the fact that it was often associated with a range of ultra-left positions. Amedeo Bordiga, who had been one of the founders of the Italian Communist Party, was a lifelong ultra-leftist who opposed any participation in parliamentary elections, virtues criticized in Lenin's left-wing communism. Bordiga argued that the proletariat had played a major role in 1917, but with the failure of the revolution to spread, Russian society had become a form of capitalism. Grandiza Muniz had argued that the tiny group of Trotskyists in Spain during... Grandiza Muniz had organized the tiny group of Trotskyists in Spain during the Civil War. In 1946, working in collaboration with the French surrealist poet Benjamin Péret, Muniz developed a version of the state capitalism argument. Muniz argued that in Marxist terms, the regime was based on the extraction of surplus value. Planning had been effectively destroyed, and the political repression was equivalent to that under fascism. From this, he drew the conclusion that there could be no support for Stalinist parties outside Russia. Quote, a party which adopts the slogan of, quote, Stalinism to power, end quote, is giving its own execution squad the order to fire, end quote. Muniz was politically close to Trotsky's widow, Natalia Sedova, who broke with the Fourth International in 1951 over the Russian question. Later, Grandizzo moved to even more extreme ultra-left positions, eventually arguing that the most urgent task for socialists was to destroy the trade unions. The most serious development of the state capitalist theory came from a small grouping, the Johnson Forrest tendency, within the Workers' Party, the group led by Shachtman, which split from the American Socialist Workers Party in 1940. Its main figures were CLR James and Raya Dunayevskaya. In 1941, Dunayevskaya published a short article with the uncompromising title, quote, "The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics in a Capitalist Society," end quote. The Union of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics is a capitalist society, end quote. Here, Dunayevskaya attacked both the orthodox Trotskyist position that the, quote, workers' state, end quote, was defined by state ownership, and Shachtman's analysis, arguing, quote, not even the most pious worker statists would contend that the workers had any power in the present Soviet state. He would merely reiterate that so long as there was statified property, etc., etc. But I deny that the social conquest of October 1917, the conscious and active political and practical participation of the masses in liberating themselves from the yoke of Tsarism, capitalism, and landlordism, are to be narrowly translated into mere statified property, that is to say, the ownership of the means of production by a state which in no way resembles the Marxian concept of a workers' state, i.e., quote, the proletariat organized as the ruling class, end quote, ... The Soviet government occupies in relation to the whole economic system the position which a capitalist occupies in relation to a single enterprise, end quote. Dunayevskaya, who knew Russian fluently, followed this up with a number of articles developing the analysis. In 1942, Dunayevskaya made a devastating critique of the official Russian statistics to reveal the facts behind them, and argued that, quote, the reality of the world market, ... would not permit Russia to tear itself out of the vortex of world economy and build, quote, socialism in one country, end quote, end quote. In 1944, Dunayevskaya published a commentary on an official Russian text which argued that the law of value functioned in the USSR. She drew the conclusion that, quote, the law of value entails the use of the concept of alienated or exploited labor, as a consequence, the concept of surplus value, end quote. Just as a side note, alienated or exploited labor does not have the concept of surplus value rolled into its constitution. There's empirical instances and actual there's empirical instances of exploitation and alienation being present in non-capitalist circumstances. A 1946 article saw Stakhanovism in the 1937 Moscow trials as the culmination of the state capitalist counter-revolution. Russia was a society in a state of profound crisis. Quote, Stalinist Russia is part of decadent world capitalism and is destined for no longer lifespan than world capitalism in its death agony, end quote. The theme was even more apparent in State Capitalism and World Revolution by CLR James in collaboration with Dunayevskaya and Grace Lee. James later insisted that this document meant a complete break with the Trotskyist tradition. While stressing the counter-revolutionary nature of Stalinism, the book argued that the, quote, whole system is in mortal crisis, end quote, and that the proletariat had never been so, quote, revolutionary as it is today, end quote. The James Dunayevskaya perspective was therefore very different from the one Cliff was slowly working his way toward. Dunayevskaya visited London in July-August 1947 and wrote several letters describing meetings with the RCP leadership. But Dunayevskaya recounted many years later, discussion of possible collaboration with Cliff did not get far. Dunayevskaya had linked her theory to both her analysis of spontaneous workers' revolts and to her philosophical position. As a result, Cliff informed her that, quote, he would rather have nothing to do with it until his own strictly economic analysis was completed, and that would take another year, end quote. Dunayevskaya gave a fuller account in a letter to Sheila Raubatham. Quote, opposition to the concept of the, quote, party to lead, end quote, was the very first topic I fought with Tony Cliff on in 1947 when I was in England on way to a Congress of the Fourth International. I had rejoined and given the right to present the theory of state capitalism. I would be the only one with that position even in that year, and since Tony was working out the same thesis I had first projected in 1941, I asked for his help. He refused on the basis that my, quote, giving up, end quote, the theory of vanguard party permitted no ground for a collaboration, and moreover his thesis, which was not yet completed, would be quite different from mine, more, quote, objective, end quote, end quote. As it turned out, they were to follow rather different paths. Dunayevskaya later wrote that, quote, after the Russian admission in 1943 that the law of value operates in Russia, there was no further point to continue the detailed analysis of their state plans, end quote. Dunayevskaya's subsequent efforts went into the, quote, philosophical, end quote, implications of the theory. Cliff, however, until at least the mid-1960s, continued to monitor closely political and economic developments in the Eastern Bloc countries. In Cliff's 1948 bulletin, there was the promise of a further document which would deal with the Johnson Forrest tendency, whom he accused of, quote, a simplification of the analysis of the Industrial Reserve Army and the crisis, end quote. This does not appear to have ever been written. There were no further significant contacts between Cliff and the Johnson Forrest tendency. In the 1950s, Cliff reported to national meetings of the SRG on developments of state capitalist groupings around the world, and Johnson Forrest was mentioned. But from the outset, the SRG, is that the Socialist Review Group, main fraternal contacts in the U.S. were with the followers of Shachtman. Though Cliff never made any public criticism of Dunayevskaya, in private conversation he was disparaging, saying that her book Marxism and Freedom had very little in it. Dunayevskaya seems to have held Cliff in equally low esteem, and many years later commented acidly on the failure of any cooperation between them. Quote, the 6-year lapse between Dunayevskaya's and Cliff could tell quite a story about non-cooperation with state capitalists in the Trotskyist movement. Tony Cliff was quite adamant about making such an analysis, quote, purely economic, end quote, end quote. While a brilliant thinker, Dunayevskaya had, according to the testimony of her erstwhile collaborator Grace Lee Boggs, a strong sense of her own importance and a sectarian mentality. Sheila Leslie, who met Dunayevskaya during her London visit, remembers her as rather high-handed and thinks she probably put Cliff's back up. It is hard to imagine any significant cooperation between her and Cliff. In terms of both personality and political perspective, there is a huge gap between them. Having decided that Russia was state capitalist, Cliff now faced a double task. On the one hand, he had to convince the supporters of orthodox Trotskyism that state capitalism was not an ultra-left eccentricity, but a valid theory compatible with the principles of the Trotskyist movement. At the same time, Cliff had to recognize the inadequacies of the theory as so far developed and give it a firmer grounding in Marxist theory and in the empirical study of Russian society. While Cliff grappled with these problems, a new difficulty arose. Cliff had lost contact with Campbell Stephen, the MP who had acted as his protector and with whose support he was able to stay in Britain. Cliff and Chaney tracked him down to a house in the country where he was seriously ill. In October 1947, just after rejoining the Labour Party, he died. The British authorities were not prepared to allow Cliff to remain in the country. All attempts at finding a university elsewhere in Europe had fallen through. He looked at the possibility of going into hiding and staying in the country illegally. He briefly considered taking up the offer of a Revolutionary Communist Party member, Sam Bornstein, to let him take his identity papers. In the end, this proved unnecessary. The Irish authorities agreed to admit him as a student. For once, Cliff's Palestinian background worked in his favor. There was still a good deal of anti-British feeling in Ireland, dating back to the independence struggle of the 1920s. In 1949, Ireland, minus the British-ruled North, could withdraw from the Commonwealth and declare itself a republic. At this point, just before the founding of Israel, the Jews of Palestine were seen as fighting a struggle for national liberation from colonial rule. So Cliff was welcomed to Ireland, where he arrived on 25th of October 1947, to stay for 4 years. When he arrived in Ireland and the immigration official discovered he was from Palestine, he clapped him warmly on the shoulder. Fortunately, when the authorities discovered that Cliff's politics were not quite what they had originally supposed, they did not revoke their decision. Chaney traveled to Ireland with Cliff. Wages were low there. As a teacher, she could have earned only £3 a week. In England, she could get 7. So she returned to London, where she had a room in Stamford Hill, where she traveled frequently to visit him. School holidays provided an opportunity to visit, but from time to time she would conveniently, quote, lose her voice, end quote, and take a fortnight off work in order to travel to Ireland. Since Chaney's income had to support both of them, Cliff's lifestyle was frugal. His normal diet was bread, jam, a bar of chocolate, and an egg each day. In March of the following year, he took up residence at 9 Grace Park Gardens, Drumcondra, a residential area in northern Dublin, where he was to remain for the rest of his time in Ireland. The British authorities were reasonably generous in allowing Cliff to visit England for quite long periods. He usually visited England for a period of 4 to 8 weeks each year. Between the 21st of June and the 25th of October 1950, the period of the formation of the SRG, Cliff was in London for 4 months. The advantages of this arrangement were not only financial. Through Chaney, Cliff was able to keep in touch with the movement in Britain, now entering a period of profound crisis. Chaney was also able to inform him about other struggles in Britain. From the summer of 1947, fascist leader Oswald Mosley tried to make a comeback, holding meetings in Ridley Road, Dalston. The Revolutionary Communist Party here were heavily involved in the demonstrations against Mosley, which mobilized up to 2,000 people. Every Saturday, the Mosleyites and the anti-fascists would compete to be the first to set up a platform, which they would then have to guard until Sunday. The police protected the Mosleyites, and there were violent clashes. On occasion, the Mosleyites were pelted with stones and rubbish from the market. Chaney and Tommy Riley, the Revolutionary Communist Party's anti-fascist organizer, toured Jewish-owned shops in Hackney and sweatshops in the East End, collecting money. This was the Revolutionary Communist Party's final involvement in mass struggle. Despite the hectic demands of political activity, the couple also started a family. In June 1949, Chaney gave birth to their first child, Ilana. If there was one thing that Cliff allowed to distract him from his single-minded devotion to the revolutionary struggle, it was his deep commitment to his family, which must have been a powerful source of inspiration in the difficult days of political isolation. On arrival in Dublin, Cliff became a student at Trinity College. Cliff did not take his studies seriously. He would sit at the back of the class, inwardly mocking the economics lecturers since his own knowledge was superior. In one lecture, he, quote, burst laughing, end quote. The lecturer asked him why, and he said that all that had been explained with complicated diagrams and mathematics was the fact that when you go to a shop, you have to buy things. But he was serious about pursuing his knowledge of economics. In the autumn of 1948, Cliff wrote to Cambridge economist and Communist Party member Maurice Daub to inquire about work on the relationship of Marx and Keynes. Daub replied that with a short list of recommended titles, Cliff would return later to work on Keynes. Cliff's main concern was to complete his work on state capitalism in Russia, now growing to the size of a full-length book. When each chapter was completed, Cliff posted it to Chaney for typing. According to his account, it was written in a mixture of English and Hebrew, and she was required to put it into comprehensible form. On this basis, Chaney qualifies as joint author of the seminal text. In the summer of 1948, the text appeared as an internal document of the Revolutionary Communist Party. Its testimony to the high standard of internal democracy that still prevailed within the Revolutionary Communist Party that agreed to circulate such a substantial oppositional statement. The text was essentially the same as that published in book form in 1955 under the title Stalinist Russia, a Marxist Analysis, though the argument was restructured for a slightly broader audience. This was the book that established Cliff as a Marxist theoretician. It has been republished several times and translated into a dozen or more foreign languages. The opening chapter began by questioning the orthodox Trotskyist definition of a, quote, workers' state, end quote. Cliff then went on to study the main features of Stalinist society and its dynamic and contradictions. There were a number of features of which made Cliff's work a more comprehensive and convincing version of the theory of state capitalism than anything that had gone before. 1. Whereas many earlier theories of state capitalism had opened the door to ultra-left conclusions, Cliff remained firmly within the mainstream of anti-Stalinist Marxism and Leninism. Most proponents of the theory had seen the Russian Revolution as either a premature utopian adventure or as having been betrayed by its bureaucratic and authoritarian leaders. Cliff insisted that he was not breaking with the Trotskyist tradition, but simply taking it to its logical conclusion. In the introduction to his document, Cliff stressed that his aim was the, quote, reorientation and rearming of the Fourth International, end quote. Cliff later argued his innovation was possible, quote, only by standing on the shoulders of the giant Leon Trotsky, end quote. Cliff based himself on the achievements of the October Revolution and criticized the Stalinist regime precisely from the standpoint of the principles of October. 2. Some critics of Stalinism had been essentially moralistic. To call Russia, quote, state capitalist, end quote, was simply a means of asserting that it was at least as brutal and oppressive as traditional capitalism had been. Cliff, however, was concerned to discover the dynamics of Russian society, to understand how it survived and how it might eventually perish. So Cliff took fundamental Marxist categories, the law of value, exploitation, the falling rate of profit, and the Marxist definition of class, and applied them in detail to the available empirical material on Russian economic and social life. 3. In particular, Cliff centered his account of Russian society on the Marxist theory of the state. Critics of socialism often argued that socialism could be defined simply in terms of state control of the economy. A centrally directed economy, like that in Russia, was by definition socialist. A mechanical adoption of Trotsky's criteria for a worker state often made concessions to this analysis. In the tradition of Lenin's State and Revolution, Cliff argued that the state was the weapon of one class against another, and that state-owned industry was a means of exploiting the workers. In the event of an authentic workers' revolution, the army and secret police could not be taken over and democratized. Quote, the Revolutionary Party will have to smash the existing state and replace it by Soviets, People's Militia, etc. End quote. 4. While Cliff drew heavily on the work of Marx, Engels, Lenin, and Trotsky, Cliff also made use of the rich tradition of Marxist political economy. In particular, Cliff made several references to the work of Nikolai Bukharin. Bukharin, executed after the Third Moscow trial in 1938, had largely been written out of the Marxist tradition. For Stalinism, Bukharin was a counter-revolutionary, but the Trotskyist tradition had not accommodated Bukharin's work. However, Cliff drew heavily on Bukharin's writings on the theoretical possibilities of state capitalism, citing from works published in German. Cliff had probably first encountered Bukharin's work in Palestine from German refugees he was in contact with. Cliff also drew on the work of Rudolf Hilferding, whose book Finance Capital Cliff described as, quote, perhaps the most important book on Marxist economics since Capital itself, end quote. 5. While Cliff was concerned to understand the internal structures of Russian society, Cliff gave fundamental importance to its place in the world system. As Marx had shown, capitalism was a global system, and Cliff's argument started from what he called the, quote, spiritual unity of the world, end quote. Its essential dynamic derived from competition, and therefore any particular economy was conditioned by its place in the total world system. In Russia's case, this took place partly through trade, but primarily through the arms race. The priorities of spending imposed by the international arms race exerted a determining pressure on the whole Russian economy. Cliff argued, quote, Stalin decides on the division of labor inside Russia in the same way as the individual capitalist decides on the division of labor in his factory, but the decision itself is derived from powers over which Stalin has no control whatsoever, is derived from the autonomy of world economy, from world competition, end quote. It is in this context that Russian, quote, planning, end quote, had to be understood. Many advocates of the view that Russia was a worker state argued this because of the, quote, planned economy, end quote, while conceding that this planning was carried out in an undemocratic way. For Cliff, such planning as existed in Russia was analogous to that which might exist with any single capitalist enterprise. For Cliff, socialist planning meant the, quote, conscious direction of the economy, end quote, and this could be achieved only through workers' control, which was conspicuously absent in Russia. Indeed, it was precisely with the establishment of the first five-year plan in 1928 that the bureaucracy became transformed into an exploiting class. Hence, there was nothing progressive about Russian planning. Quote, so long as the working class has no control over production, the workers are not the subject of planning, but planning's object, end quote. Russian, quote, planning, end quote, was not necessarily able to achieve even the same productivity of labor as Western capitalism. By showing that Russia was, like Western capitalism, driven by the dynamic of international capitalism, Cliff was pointing to the essential similarities of the two social orders. Russian capitalism was doing exactly what British capitalism had done over several centuries, but much more rapidly and hence even more brutally. Quote, Stalin accomplished in a few hundred days what it took Britain a few hundred years to do, end quote. Thus, the Russian development could illuminate the increasing role of the state in Western economies in the post-war period. Cliff noted, quote, the nationalizations in England carried out by the Labour government bring us sharply to realize that the form of property alone is not the fundamental determinant of the class character of an economy and a state, end quote. From the workers' point of view, there was nothing to choose between the two regimes. 8. There had been an important inconsistency in the orthodox Trotskyist view of Russia. On the one hand, the Russian system was seen as unstable and in deep crisis, the ball balanced on the point of a sphere. Yet, at the same time, Russia's economic achievements were hailed as proof of the superiority of the planned economy. Cliff was able to overcome this inconsistency by showing that the achievements of the Russian economy were indeed formidable. Quote, the tempo of development of the productive forces in Stalinist Russia is greater than it has been in any other country at any time, end quote. In 1957, Russia with Sputnik would lead the world in the crucial field of satellite technology. As Marx had shown, capitalism historically had, quote, played a most revolutionary part, end quote. But it also was a system with internal contradictions that would destroy it. Russia's rapid development derived in considerable part from the repressive regime's ability to press workers' living standards. Trotsky's analysis of the... I was just listening today to the audiobook that I made of Trotsky's The Revolution Betrayed. It's chapter 1, What Has Been Accomplished. And in that chapter, he kind of starts off with the same kind of thing where he talks about all the great achievements that have been made in Russia over the past, between 1925 and say 1935. As if that technology, that fucking breakneck accumulation could somehow be divorced by the substantial social and indeed human content of that relation, but of that accumulation and that development. But the thing that I was actually thinking about right now in relation to this is that Trotsky kind of immediately says, yeah, there's been this great improvement, there's been this great industrial process, and then he goes on to say how kind of like undercuts that whole thing. I don't know if I guess he's aware of like the contradictory nature of this. It's probably part of it is like the sheer he emphasizes the lack of quality of Russian or Soviet production. So not only consumer goods, but means of production department goods were extremely shoddily made, and there's it's well documented after the fact as well. In contemporary economic histories of the Soviet Union, just how frequently uh, large batches of production were just so shittily made, the products that came out of Soviet production were often so horribly designed, or not designed, but shittily made, that it was just like the entire production was a waste. Like if you build, if you you know if you build a train track and it doesn't fucking satisfy the needs of a train track, not only did you not build anything, but you wasted a tremendous amount of time and resources and energy into doing this. So he kind of like, Trotsky at least has the merit of emphasizing the problems of low production quality in the Soviet Union. 9, and I'm sure Cliff probably says something like that elsewhere, but it's not being mentioned here. Since the Russian economy was essentially driven by its place in the world economy, the production of armaments played a central role in its workings. Cliff devoted several pages of his document to analyzing the place of armaments in the Russian economy and the importance of the fact that such great resources were devoted to the means of destruction. Cliff would later develop the argument to show how similar mechanisms operated in Western capitalism. Cliff recognized that the society existing in Russia was a new historical phenomenon, something which none of the classic Marxists, outside of brief hypothetical speculations, had ever envisaged. To define Russia as capitalist did not mean ignoring the profoundly original features in Stalinist society. Cliff resolved this problem by describing state capitalism as being a, quote, partial negation, end quote, of traditional capitalism. Certain aspects of the system did not function exactly the same ways in the West. Thus, quote, the state as a regulator of economic functions, even if it is not yet the repository of the means of production, partially negates the law of value. Cliff even went so far, 11. Cliff even went so far as to describe state capitalism as, quote, a transition to socialism, end quote. It is important to be clear that he meant what he meant by this. He argued, quote, everything that centralizes the means of production centralizes the working class. State capitalism brings this concentration to the highest stage possible under the capitalist system, end quote. There is nothing progressive about state capitalism, which, quote, signifies the extreme subjugation of the working class by the capitalist class, which controls the means of production, end quote. Its only merit was to encourage the unity of its gravediggers. 12. This led to the essence of Cliff's argument. The point was not to interpret state capitalism, but to destroy state capitalism. If the mechanisms of the Russian economy were essentially capitalist, then Russia had a massive working class with the potential to overthrow it. Russian workers were not slaves, but proletarians who posed a constant threat to the bureaucracy. Cliff recognized the difficulties in the way of working class organization in a totalitarian state, but Cliff also saw a fatal contradiction facing the bureaucracy. In order to raise the productivity of labor, working-class living standards would have to be raised. Quote, but workers, besides having hands, have heads. The raising of the standard of living and culture of the masses means to raise their self-confidence, increase their appetite, their impatience at their lack of democratic rights and personal security, and their impatience at the bureaucracy for which preserves these burdens, end quote. Cliff concluded with a hopeful scenario, quote, the final chapter can be written only by the masses, self-mobilized, conscious of socialist aims and the methods of their achievement, and led by a revolutionary Marxist party, end quote. Cliff. Cliff may not have been original in all these points, but taken together they produce a synthesis which raised the argument for state capitalism to a higher level than anything written previously. The document was circulated to the Revolutionary Communist Party membership, though unfortunately it was too late to be distributed to delegates to the Fourth International Congress. Initially, however, it did not make a major impact. Ken Tarbuck, I was looking up to see if there's anything for Ken Tarbuck online. There's not. Well, there is, but there's no like easy, straightforward Wikipedia entry thing. The document was circulated. Blah blah blah. Where am I? Ken Tarbuck, a young member of the Birmingham branch who would later join the state capitalist grouping, recalled, quote, "We had all seen his massive internal bulletin on the question of state capitalism in Russia, ... but none of us had been sufficiently convinced to become followers of Cliff. Given all the other matters that had been besetting us around that time, it is hardly surprising that Cliff did not make much impression." End quote. Ken Tarbuck. Sheila Leslie was a young comrade who was very serious about reading all the internal documents. Sheila Leslie had some doubts about the official theory, but found it hard to make a break. Revolutionary Communist Party members were reluctant to abandon defense of the USSR when the leadership were arguing that this underpinned all the other policies of the Revolutionary Communist Party. Yet, Sheila Leslie felt that while Cliff's contributions to the debate were somewhat academic, they did add to knowledge, unlike much of what was written. Though the initial circulation of Cliff's document was confined to the tiny Revolutionary Communist Party, over the coming years it was to exercise a certain influence on an international scale. Throughout the Fourth International, questions were being asked about the nature of Stalinism, and an apparently obscure document like Cliff's rapidly got an international circulation. After 1945, the Cuban Trotskyist organization, the Partido Obrero Revolucionario, adopted a state capitalist position. The Partido Obrero Revolucionario were clearly impressed when they received Cliff's document, for it confirmed their positions. In 1949, they sent a letter to the French group Socialisme ou Barbarie, Socialism or Barbarism, urging them to study Cliff's 1948 internal document on Russia. It went on to state that Alfred Rosmer was translating Cliff's document into French, though nothing came of this. Socialisme ou Barbarie had split from the Fourth International in 1949 on the basis of an analysis which identified tendencies towards bureaucracy in both Western and Stalinist society. Socialisme ou Barbarie rejected any notion that Russia was a, quote, worker state, end quote, though they did not see it as capitalist. Socialisme ou Barbarie did not take much further interest in Cliff's work, though there was correspondence in 1950. But these conferences do show that Cliff's work was making a certain international impact on the declining and fragmenting Trotskyist movement. There were also contacts with a publication titled La Lutte, said to be the paper of the, quote, independent French communist, end quote. This group acknowledged receipt of Cliff's document on Russia and promised to translate it and publish it as a pamphlet, although there is no indication that this actually happened. Cliff and the SRG were in contact with the left wing of the Ukrainian Revolutionary Democratic Party, which published the paper Vpered, Forward. That's the name of the journal that was under the... it's not probably the same one. It's probably just... that's the same name as a journal that was written by... or newspaper. I'm not sure if it was a newspaper or journal. It's a publication by... Alexander Bogdanov. I believe like the turn of the century. Early 20th century. These emigres, former citizens of the USSR, had supporters in Britain, Germany, and the US and elsewhere. Their paper had a circulation of 3,000. The left wing of the Ukrainian Revolutionary Democratic Party opposed both Stalinism and private capitalism, and some of their leading thinkers had developed the position somewhat earlier than Cliff that Russia was state capitalist, quote, the highest and final stage of development of the capitalist system because it brings the concentration of capital and the socialization of labor to the highest possible point, end quote. In 1950 and 1951, Vpered published 2 chapters from Cliff's The Nature of Stalinist Russia on Class Struggle in Russia and the Imperialist Expansion of Russia. An article by V.S. Felix Vsevolod Chlumnitchy on the social composition of the Supreme Council of the USSR appeared in the first issue of Socialist Review. In the 1955 edition of his book on Russia, Cliff commented the UPA, Ukrainian Resurgent Army, commended the UPA, Ukrainian Resurgent Army, for its position to both capitalism and, quote, Stalinist pseudo-socialism, end quote. More surprisingly, Cliff's work succeeded in penetrating inside the Stalinist bloc. In 1956, at the time of Khrushchev's revelations about Stalin, the Russian KGB, secret police and intelligence organization, commissioned a translation of Cliff's book. The introduction stated, quote, "The book, provokes understandable interest, especially in the light of the 20th Party Congress, The author's basic aim is to set out the Trotskyist thesis of the impossibility of socialism in one country, analyzing economic and socio-political aspects of the Soviet socialist system. Cliff arrives at the conclusion that the USSR is state capitalist. Cliff argues that in the Soviet Union there has been a transformation of the workers' state and a bureaucratization of the party and state apparatus, and that a new, quote, class, end quote, of bureaucrats has arisen which reduced to zero all the gains of the October Revolution, usurping the rights and freedoms of the workers and imposing on them the most cruel exploitation in the interest of capital accumulation. Cliff characterizes the USSR as a reactionary social system in which there exist deep class contradictions, end quote." KGB. Introduction to Cliff's work. The translation was not made openly available. It was kept in a special section of a library to which access was strictly controlled. But in the 1980s, a student managed to photograph the book with a miniature camera. Copies of the translation were circulated by a group of anarchists. Some people were jailed for being in possession of the translation. It is proof of the significance of Cliff's work that it was taken so seriously in the heart of the enemy camp. In 1957, the Yugoslav dissident Milovan Djilas was jailed for his influential book, The New Class, which argued that there was a new ruling class in Russia and Eastern Europe. In the 1960s, there was a rumor, perhaps originating with the historian Vladimir Dedijer, who had been tried with Djilas in 1955 and who taught in Britain in the early 1960s, that at the time of his arrest in 1956 for supporting the Hungarian Revolution, Djilas had been in possession of a copy of Cliff's book on Russia. Cliff used to recount the story with a certain degree of satisfaction. Djilas' son believes that this is unlikely, although he cannot rule it out entirely. During the summer of 1968, Joel Geyer, who was traveling in Europe, met Ivan Svitak, a well-known Czech dissident philosopher. Svitak told him that he had visited Yugoslavia in the 1960s and had got a hold of a copy of Cliff's book on Russia. He asked Joel to thank Cliff for him. I have a piece by Ivan Svitak on here. That's from the Socialist Humanism compendium put together by Eric Fromm. It features a lot of dissident Eastern left-wing Marxist. The official Revolutionary Communist Party reply to Cliff came from Ted Grant. Let me look up Ted Grant for a second. Edward Grant, this picture of him is a horrific haircut. He looks like, it's fucking hilarious because he looks like the most like English man you've ever seen. He looks like Austin Powers in this picture on the Wikipedia page. Edward Grant, born Isaac Blanc, lived from the 9th of July 1913 to the 20th of July 2006 and was a South African Trotskyist who spent most of his adult life in Britain. He was a founding member of the group Militant and later Socialist Appeal. The official Revolutionary Communist Party reply to Cliff came from Ted Grant. It was a serious but vigorous polemic, which initiated many of the arguments that would be used against Cliff over the coming 50 years. Grant defended Trotsky, often referred to as, quote, the old man, end quote, to stress that Grant was a loyal disciple, and scornfully dismissed Cliff's claims to have found anomalies or contradictions in Trotsky's work. For Grant, Stalin's Russia was, quote, a transitional society in which some of the laws peculiar to socialism apply and some peculiar to capitalism, end quote. This leaves the problem that, since transition implies movement, Russia would have to be moving closer to socialism, something for which Grant provided no evidence. Grant argued that if Cliff were right, quote, a new epoch, the epoch of state capitalism, opens up before us. This would shatter the entire theoretical basis of the Leninist-Trotskyist movement, end quote. End quote. If a new period of state capitalism looms ahead, then to talk of this being a period of the disintegration of world capitalism reduces itself to mere phrase-mongering, end quote. Grant had a point here. Cliff's position did challenge the perspective of revolutionary upheavals in the near future, though Cliff himself had not yet thought through all the implications. Grant seemed more concerned to defend the Trotskyist orthodoxy than to look at the realities of a changing world. Grant contended that many of the features drawn out by Cliff would exist even in a healthy workers' state. This led him to accuse Cliff of drawing a, quote, idealist and false picture of the state under Lenin and Trotsky, end quote, and to claim that, quote, Cliff may argue that unless the working class has direct control of the state cannot be a workers' state. In that case, Cliff will have to reject the idea that there was a workers' state in Russia, except possibly in the first few months, end quote. I think there's a lot of personally, I think there's a lot of truth in that statement, except I would accept that conclusion. I would accept that Cliff would have to reject the idea that there was a worker state in Russia, except possibly in the first few months. That's just a personal aside to myself. Here Grant was on a slippery slope. By rejecting Cliff's insistence that a socialist revolution required conscious control by the workers, Ted Grant was raising issues far more important than the precise chronology of the degeneration of the Russian Revolution. Ted Grant revealed that Ted Grant was prepared to accept some very odd criteria for a, quote, workers' state, end quote. Ted Grant argued that, quote, a working class can be a ruling class when a great portion of the working class are in jail in Siberia, end quote. And that, quote, under certain conditions, the dictatorship of the proletariat could also be realized through the dictatorship of one man, end quote. The debate broadened from the, quote, Russian question, end quote, in itself to a more general consideration of the nature of socialism and the process of transition to it. There is no indication at this stage that Cliff envisaged that the argument about the nature of Russia was an issue which would lead to a split in the Revolutionary Communist Party. Nor apparently did the Revolutionary Communist Party leadership believe it was a question which should inevitably lead to a split. Trotsky himself, however hostile he had been to state capitalist analyses, had insisted in 1939 that the question itself did not warrant a split in the movement. The question that was causing much more immediate concern within the Revolutionary Communist Party was entry into the Labour Party. Intervention by the International Executive produced an ad hoc solution. The pro-entry minority would form a separate organization and put their strategy into practice while the rest of the Revolutionary Communist Party would carry on as previously. But now the crisis of Trotskyism was maturing rapidly. In February 1948, the Czech Communist Party excluded other parties and took sole power. Despite a staged walk-on role for the working class, this is in effect a Stalinist coup. Under the headline, Capitalist Routed in Czechoslovakia, Haston, in Socialist Appeal, described the events as, quote, an important victory for the working class, end quote, while making some reservations about the way the Stalinists controlled the movement. As the Cold War intensified, the polarization between East and West increased, and the pressure on anti-Stalinist revolutionaries to line up with one side or the other intensified. In the summer of 1948, the Fourth International held its Second World Congress. A number of oppositional delegates formed a loose bloc at the Congress. These were Shachtman of the U.S. Workers' Party, present with consultative status, Grace Lee on behalf of the James Dunievskaya Group, which had now returned to the Fourth International, Cornelius Castoriadis from France, who would soon form the Socialissimo Barbarie Group, Jacques Gallienne, also from France, Muniz from Spain, Bob Armstrong from Ireland, and an observer from Indochina. Sorry, I got to look some of these people up. I don't know if it's going to say, but I know that I think at this conference, uh, there's a thing in Alexander's book that I thought was super interesting. Uh, that he was saying something to the effect that Max Shachtman said that like they lined up with the uh, Chalus Montal, I think that's how you say it, tendency, which is the Castoriadis Lafort tendency, because they agreed on major points, which I thought was super interesting. Because I'm kind of always on the lookout for the relationship between like later state capitalist theorists that came out to prominence in like the late 40s and early 50s, such as Cliff Donievskaya and Castoriadis. And the earlier generation of, say, Shachtman, Burnham, and Carter. So I thought that was super interesting. I want to see if this Jacques Galien guy is somebody. No, doesn't look like there's anything up for him. I mean, it says his name is in things. It's funny that the first thing that came up for Jacques Galien was a piece from Novon, the Vietnamese Trotskyist who became a council communist in France in the after in the 1960s and 1970s and on. So that's interesting. Muniz from Spain. That's Grandizo Muniz. So we know who that is. I have some pieces from Grandizo Muniz. There's a great. It was a really informative Grandizo Muniz documentary on the internet, but I can't find it anywhere. But yeah, he's a super interesting figure. Bob Armstrong. First person that comes up is a professional wrestler. So that's just like Bob Armstrong, Trotskyist. Bob Armstrong. It looks like there's some things on Northern Ireland. Anyway, there's nothing. I don't see anything for Bob Armstrong. Bob Armstrong from Ireland and observer from Indochina. I wonder if that observer from Indochina is Novon. Now that would be interesting. Although they held a variety of positions on the Russian question, they argued that the Fourth International should drop its commitment to, quote, defense of the Soviet Union, end quote. The, quote, orthodox leadership combined to crush them. The American Socialist Workers Party, Ernest Mandel, Michel Pablo, and the leaders of the French section, Pierre Franck, Pierre Lambert, and Michel Mest, all united to defend the majority line. The last hope of a Fourth International able to relate to the unexpected challenges of the post-war period had disappeared. Within a few years, the dominant bloc would fly apart and they would be at each other's throats as split followed split. Yeah, there was a big split within the majority that rejected all these figures would be at each other's throats eventually. You know, especially over like Pablo's, like I think the thing was basically the split was over Pablo, who was like the leader of the Fourth International, taking on the position that these deformed worker states could last for hundreds of years and were not really that temporary, but they were superior to capitalism. And what Trotskyists needed to do was like a new form of entrism, which included entrism in Stalinist parties, I believe, and some people within the majority Orthodox Trotskyist leadership were like, fuck that. So, yeah. Basically, people call Pablo, I think that in that world, I mean, I'm not an expert on it because I'm not a Trotskyist, and if I was a Trotskyist, it definitely wouldn't be an Orthodox Trotskyist, but in that world, to my understanding, people who would be, I think Pablo's section was called the International Secretariat, and the people that opposed Pablo was like the Executive Committee, or the International Committee. And people in the International Committee confused Pablo and like his followers as being like liquidationist or whatever, like, which means basically dissolving like kind of. I think they had the idea that Pablo's politics necessarily entailed the like dissolving of any independent Trotskyist movement, so to speak of. I mean, I'm not sure about, I'm probably not retelling the ins and outs of that debate, and I've only read one piece on it, so I can't really speak on it. I do have a biography of Michel Pablo on the page, just because he's an important figure to know something about if you're interested in the history of Trotskyism. But there's also a piece about, the history of the internationals, and then, the first split in the Fourth International. Well, not the first, but the big split that happened in the 1950s that would be partially resolved in the early 1960s, in a piece by Robert J. Alexander that's on this channel. So watch any of the videos from Robert J. Alexander. They'll tell you a lot. Anyway. So let me read the last sentence, which is absolutely true. Within a few years, the dominant bloc would fly apart and they would be at each other's throats as split followed split. At just about this time, half the membership of the French section left in order to join the short-lived Rassemblement Démocratique Révolutionnaire headed by David Rousset and Jean-Paul Sartre, which took a line of opposition to both major power blocs in the world. I don't know when this new let me look at this. The translation, at least according to Wikipedia, is Revolutionary Democratic Rally. This is not according to Wikipedia, according to Google, because I had to translate a French Wikipedia page. But it says the Revolutionary Democratic Rally, RDR, which I guess is a short-lived French political party which was founded in post-war period, late 1947, early 1948, among others by David Rousset, Georges Altman, and Jean-Paul Sartre. The party lasted barely more than a year. Alright, so back to the text. I guess I should look up who David Rousset is. David Rousset lived from 1912 to 1997 and was a French writer and political activist, a recipient of Prix Renaudot, a French literary award, a survivor of the Neuengamme concentration camp and the Buchenwald Nazi concentration camp. Rousset is famous for his books about concentration camps. Rousset was the first person to use the term gulag in the French language, revealing to the French the Soviet system of labor camps. In 1949, learning that while the concentration camps in Germany had been destroyed, camps still existed in the Soviet Union, Rousset appealed to former inmates of Nazi camps to form a commission to inspect the USSR camps, which became the, quote, International Commission Against Concentrationist Regimes, end quote. For David Rousset's efforts, he was attacked by Pierre Daye in the French communist newspaper Les Lettres Françaises, which accused him of slandering the Soviet Union, forging the text of the Soviet laws, and spreading misinformation. Rousset brought libel charges against the newspaper, and in 1951 he won the case. Along with Jean-Paul Sartre, Albert Camus, and Gerard Rosenthal, Rousset was the founder of the left-wing Rassemblement Démocratique Révolutionnaire, Revolutionary Democratic Rally, which called for a European federation on democratic socialist lines. In 1968, David Rousset was elected as deputy of the French National Assembly as a left-wing Gaullist. David Rousset resigned in November 1970. So, back to the text. Shortly after the Congress, an even bigger shock occurred. Tito's Yugoslavia broke publicly with Stalin. Within a short time, Moscow was claiming that its former ally had degenerated into fascism. This split with Stalinism offered opportunities and posed problems for the Fourth International. The leadership, however, responded in a peculiar fashion. They sided enthusiastically with Tito, apparently forgetting that only weeks earlier Yugoslavia had been defined as a bourgeois state. They now saw Yugoslavia as a worker state, and in order to avoid an intolerable inconsistency, they soon came to describe all Stalin's other satellites in Eastern Europe as worker states also. In the Hal Draper's, I believe in Hal Draper's piece, The Economic Drive Behind Tito, he basically argues that Tito's anti-Stalinism, the Tito's split with Stalin was a Stalinist split from Stalin, more or less. And to say it was no longer Stalinist because they worked politically with Stalin would be too superficial an analysis. It was the end of the road for the Revolutionary Communist Party. Sheila Leslie recalls a terrible factional atmosphere and squabbling and fighting all the time, though she thinks Cliff and Chaney were not really involved in the factional disputes. In June 1949, the Revolutionary Communist Party was formally dissolved and replaced by a clandestine body with the innocuous title of, quote, the Club, end quote. By now, most of the Revolutionary Communist Party leadership had decided to follow the example of the minority and to support entry into the Labour Party. Members of the, quote, Club joined the Labour Party as individuals. As Robert Sewell, who along with one of Grant's followers, who I think is also part of like the, in defense of Marxism world that's around with like, I think it's, what's his name? Alan Wood, I think his name is. Robert Sewell, one of Grant's followers, has pointed out at this stage, quote, work inside the Labour Party was not based on a previously worked out strategy or tactic, but simply a matter of necessity, end quote. Haston, the most able of the leadership, saw no future and resigned from the, quote, Club, end quote, abandoning revolutionary politics in favor of open reformism. With the disappearance of Jock Haston and the failure of Ted Grant to offer any political alternative, more influence came into the hands of Jerry Healy. Healy is now best known for his pathetic end of the 1980s when he was expelled by his own organization for violence and sexual abuse of female comrades. It is not necessary to project his later misdeeds back onto his younger self to recognize that while he was an organizer of some talent, he was both short on theory and very strong on authoritarian measures. The Revolutionary Communist Party annual Congress that had taken place in August 1947, just before Cliff's departure for Ireland. According to police reports on the events classified, quote, secret, end quote, but which may not be wholly reliable, Cliff, quote, made a strong personal attack on Healy and his records, saying that he merely wanted to collar the leadership of the party. The minority was, in his view, heading for expulsion, end quote. Meanwhile, Cliff, for the second time in 2 years, was adjusting to life in a new city. Dublin, at this time, was a conservative place. Divorce and contraception were both banned by the strongly Catholic regime. Cliff must have seen some parallels between the role of the Irish priesthood and the rabbis he remembered from Palestine. In the early years of the Cold War, clerical reaction joined forces with pro-American anti-communism. The mainstream of the labor movement was firmly in the grip of right-wing ideas, as Cliff himself could observe on the streets of Dublin. Quote, on the 1st of May 1949, an estimated 150,000 people, many of them workers following Union banners, marched through Dublin against, quote, the evils of communism, end quote, in Eastern Europe, ... The platform was dominated by trade union speakers who threatened to suppress any communist party that reared its head in Catholic Ireland, end quote. That sounds about right. And it's also important to note that the Catholic government in the 1930s did not support, not that any other countries did as well, but you think that a newly formed republic would have solidarity with a republic trying to get on its feet in Spain, but that was not the case because it was, the republic was ostensibly anti-clerical. In 1949, the Literary and Historical Society, University College Dublin, invited Owen Sheehy Skeffington to speak on the rather anodyne topic. I don't know who Owen Sheehy Skeffington is. Skeffington is the most English sounding name I've ever heard, but it might not even be English, but it sounds like it. Owen Sheehy Skeffington, who lived from 1909 to 1970, was an Irish university lecturer and senator. Son of pacifist feminists and socialists Francis and Hannah Sheehy Skeffington, he is politically like-minded and as a member of the Irish Senate was praised as a defender of civil liberty, democracy, separation of church and state, freedom of speech, women's rights, minority rights, and other liberal values. So let me get back to the text. In 1949, the Literary and Historical Society at University College Dublin invited Owen Sheehy Skeffington to speak on the rather anodyne topic, quote, that the ideals of the Communist Manifesto are worthy of humanity, end quote. The meeting was promptly banned by the college authorities. In this situation, there was not much of a left milieu. Trotskyism in Ireland had a fairly tenuous existence. At the beginning of the Second World War, a number of British Trotskyists, including Jerry Healy and Jock Haston, had moved to Dublin for a while, and groups were built in both Belfast and Dublin. In 1944, the Revolutionary Socialist Party was founded with some 20 members in Belfast and Dublin, but by the time Clift arrived, the organization was in sharp decline. The leading Belfast comrades, Bob and Elsie Armstrong, had been forced to move to London. There were sharp internal differences over the Russian question, and the environment became more difficult to work in. The Stalinists persuaded the police to arrest John Byrne, Byrne, the leading militant in Dublin, for selling papers. Can't really exaggerate the treachery of Stalinism. Really, really can. Can't find anything of him online. In August 1948, some months after Clift's arrival, Byrne reported to the International Secretary to the Fourth International. After describing the situation in Belfast as, quote, rather hopeless, end quote, he went on to deal with Dublin. Quote, in Dublin we have lost one comrade. He is a Shachtmanite and is almost completely demoralized. He has not met us for the past 2 months. He defends the position of the Belfast comrades with regard to disbanding the Irish section. There are 2 comrades left. One is the Socialist Youth, Stalinists, and the other, myself, active in the trade union movement. I am a member of the National Executive Committee of the Workers' Union of Ireland, with a membership of 24,000, a member of the Dublin Trades Council, was a delegate to the Irish Trade Union Congress for the last 2 Congresses, and am on the branch committee of my own union, Corporation Workers. I am in the Irish Labour Party, but it is very dead and there is no prospect of quick returns. The Socialist Youth, Stalinists, with a membership of about 60, is very active. I think this is our best field of recruitment, and as it is impossible for us, because of the lack of forces, to work openly, we consider it best to work inside the Labour Party and the Socialist Youth. We shall do our best to maintain and build the Irish section of the Fourth International, end quote. Johnny Byrne. Despite this brave conclusion, Irish Trotskyism was effectively dead. It would not revive until the different circumstances of the 1960s. Byrne himself was a dedicated militant. Owen Sheehy Skeffington's widow, Andrea, I'm not sure if I'm saying that right, remembered him very favorably. Quote, another regular laborer, Johnny Byrne was more down to earth, honest and straight. Johnny Byrne was very critical of the Labour Party and trade union leaders, but also his fellow workers when he found them unreliable in their work, let alone in their union of Labour Party activities. He trusted Owen's judgment, although he knew that Owen, interested in every shade of left-wing thought, did not adhere to the Fourth International, end quote. Byrne and Clift became good friends and went to the cinema together every week and sometimes to the theater, but there was little opportunity for any political activity. One of the last publications of the Revolutionary Socialist Party before it disintegrated was a leaflet about the commemoration of the 80th anniversary of James Connolly's birth. Entitled, quote, Who Wears Connolly's Mantle, end quote, It took a hard anti-Stalinist line declaring that, quote, the new social formation in Russia was absolutely absolutely in common with the free socialism envisaged by Lenin and Trotsky, nor does it bear any resemblance to the type of working-class democracy envisaged by Connolly or any other true socialist, end quote. In denouncing the, quote, tyrannical, anti-socialist, barbarous, and totalitarian nature of Stalinism, end quote. It has been suggested that Cliff may have had a hand in drafting this, but there is no evidence of this. There were several others in the Revolutionary Socialist Party who rejected the, quote, worker state, end quote, analysis of Russia. Cliff made one other important friend during the period. Owen Sheehy Skeffington had lived a turbulent life. Owen Sheehy Skeffington's father had been shot by the British in 1916, and to escape from the country to America with his mother, he had been obliged as a child of only 7 to learn to give a false name to deceive the authorities. Owen Sheehy Skeffington later returned to Ireland and became a well-known academic and public figure. Owen Sheehy Skeffington was a man of the independent left, at times a member of the Labour Party, from which Owen Sheehy Skeffington was expelled in 1943. In her biography of him, his widow, Andrea, listed the issues on which he campaigned during his life. Quote, housing, health, government's autocratic inclinations, education, partition, civil liberties, the profit motive of simply smugness, hypocrisy, and cant in high places, end quote. In the cold, who's that? That was his wife, Andrea Sheehy Skeffington. In the Cold War context, Owen Sheehy Skeffington showed equal distaste for Washington and Moscow, arguing that, quote, McCarthyism and the thought control sections of the Smith Act were the American counterpart of the Stalinist system to be equally condemned, end quote. He commented wryly that, quote, there is a tendency in this country for me to be considered a communist by virtually everybody except the communist, end quote. When Owen Sheehy Skeffington spoke for the Labour Party against the government's trade union bill, he was noted in police records as a member of the Fourth International. In fact, Owen Sheehy Skeffington never had any organizational links with Trotskyism, though he was a good friend of such Trotskyists as Paddy Trench and Johnny Byrne. Let me see if there's anything for these people. Yeah, there's nothing like brief about Paddy Trench, but I am seeing Paddy Trench things on Google when I search Paddy Trench. Every Friday evening, Owen Sheehy Skeffington and his wife would open their home to foreign students and refugees in Dublin. Cliff was a regular attender. He enjoyed the intellectual company, but also, in view of his restricted diet, the cakes that were provided. In her biography, Andrea claims, quote, another type of dissident was the Israeli emigre Yigal Gluckstein, who entertained us with examples of dialectics from his upbringing as an Orthodox Jew and applied his nimble and hard-trained mind to a critical examination of Soviet, quote, colonialism, end quote, on which he was writing a book, end quote. Cliff greatly liked Sheehy Skeffington, who was most helpful to him and assisted with revising the style of Stalin's satellites in Europe. A decade later on, the SRG branch was briefly established. An SRG branch was briefly established in Dublin, and a school was organized at which Cliff, Alistair McIntyre, and Sheehy Skeffington spoke. McIntyre remembered that Cliff was delighted to be reunited with his old friend. Alistair McIntyre, I don't think he remained a Marxist, but he went on to be a famous philosopher, right? Scottish-American philosopher. And he's still alive. Christ. Old man, though. 1929. Alistair McIntyre, who was born in 1929, is a Scottish-American philosopher who has contributed to moral and political philosophy as well as history of philosophy and theology. McIntyre's After Virtue, published in 1981, is one of the most important works of Anglophone moral and political philosophy in the 20th century. McIntyre is Senior Research Fellow at the Center for Contemporary Aristotelian Studies in Ethics and Politics at London Metropolitan University, Emeritus Professor of Philosophy at the University of Notre Dame, and Permanent Senior Distinguished Research Fellow at the Notre Dame Center for Ethics and Culture. During his lengthy academic career, he was taught at Brandeis University, Duke University, Vanderbilt University, and Boston University. McIntyre remembered that Cliff was delighted to be reunited with his old friend. On one occasion in 1949 or 1950, Cliff spoke to the Dublin Fabian Society on the basis of his research on Eastern Europe. A number of Stalinists were present. They were active in the Fabian Society. That they were active in the Fabian Society was a sign of the low level of left activity in Dublin. Sheehy Skeffington, who chaired the meeting, described the occasion in a letter to a friend. Quote, "We had an excellent Fabian meeting at which a Jewish refugee from Israel, yes, he had done jail there for taking a proper socialist line about Arabs, attacked the Soviet persecution of the Jews, the, quote, doctor's plot, end quote, etc. 11 Jews out of 14 doctors, and he was so well informed that the Stalinists present nearly lynched him. He was of Russian stock, Israel-born, and read Russian fluently and knew his facts. A good meeting," end quote. There were few distractions for Cliff. Cliff's one great pleasure was the theater. Dublin had at least two theaters, the Abbey and the Gate, which staged serious drama, and they were often the subject of controversy because of the radical nature of the material performed there. Cliff got an introduction to Irish drama, especially the work of Sean O'Casey. He probably saw such plays as the savage anti-war drama, The Silver Tassie, or The Plough, and The Stars, which dealt with the 1916 Rising. The latter play had caused huge controversy when first performed in 1926 because it seemed to question how far the struggle for national independence was relevant for ordinary working people. Cliff would have appreciated the irony of the fact that the character in the play, the Covey, who most clearly sees the limits of the national struggle, quote, "What's thus a freedom if it's not economic freedom? There's only one war worth having. The war for the economic emancipation of the proletariat," end quote, is presented as a boring abstract propagandist. Many years later, Cliff told the New Statesman that O'Casey was the playwright whose work he would like everyone to see. He also had the opportunity of seeing some of the classics of modern theater, including Strindberg's The Father and Arthur Miller's Death of a Salesman. Having finished his document on state capitalism, Cliff produced two more related texts. The first is a short consideration of the theory of, quote, bureaucratic collectivism, end quote. Cliff rejected the theory because the theory of bureaucratic collectivism gave no account of the dynamic of the system and because it denied Russian workers the status of being proletarians, hence made them incapable of self-emancipation. The second was a much more substantial piece titled On the Class Nature of the, quote, People's Democracies, end quote. This is the basis for his first published book, Stalin's Satellites in Europe. It took up the argument about state capitalism from a different angle, dealing at length with the question of the Fourth International's change of tack over Yugoslavia. Cliff took on the whole question of the agency of socialist transformation. Cliff pointed out, quote, "Members of the Fourth International day in, day out repeat the basic Marxist conceptions. The liberation of the working class can be carried out only by the working class itself. Class conscious and led by a revolutionary party, that it cannot lay hold of the bourgeois state machine, but must smash the bourgeois state machine and establish in the bourgeois state machine's place a state of a new type, a state of proletarian democracy, Soviets, etc., end quote. Yet it was accepted that the satellite states in Europe were worker states. Yet if it was accepted that the satellite states in Europe were worker states, these fundamentals of Marxism would have to be abandoned. If Stalinism could create new worker states, then the whole role of the Fourth International was called into question. One of the most important parts of the argument was the question of consciousness. Here Cliff distinguished between bourgeois and socialist revolutions. Bourgeois revolutions were often made without the conscious intention of the bourgeoisie and without the active involvement of the masses. In this respect, the Great French Revolution of 1789 was the exception rather than the rule. A socialist revolution, however, could only be made as the conscious act of the working class. Cliff insisted, quote, "Marx repeated hundreds of times that the proletarian revolution is the conscious act of the working class itself. Therefore, if we accept that the, quote, people's democracies, end quote, are worker states, that what Marx and Engels said about the socialist revolution being, quote, history conscious of itself, end quote, is refuted. Refuted is Engels' statement, quote, it is only from this point, bracket, the socialist revolution, end bracket, that men with full consciousness will fashion their own history. It is only from this point that the social causes set in motion by men will have, predominantly and in constantly increasing measure, the effects willed by men. It is humanity's leap from the realm of necessity into the realm of freedom, end quote. Engels, Anti-Düring, end quote, Cliff. This argument would remain at the center of Cliff's conception of the revolutionary process and hence the heart of his conception of socialism. The argument about state capitalism was not simply about how certain regimes were to be defined. It was about the essence of socialism. For Cliff, no force, whether labor politicians or Russian tanks, could substitute the self-conscious activity of the working class. So Cliff continued his lonely studies in Dublin, longing to be reunited with his wife and new child, and perhaps hoping against rational expectation that the Fourth International would see the error of its ways and return to authentic revolutionary Marxism. But the whole situation would soon be transformed by events in a distant Asian country of which Cliff had probably scarcely heard. Yeah, this is... I guess I'll read these footnotes. That's the end of the chapter. And instead of having footnotes, they have endnotes, which I fucking hate. First note. The claim by a Daily Telegraph journalist that, quote, Tony Cliff is himself believed to have been wealthy on arrival in Britain, end quote, in B. Baker, The Far Left, London, 1981, seems to issue from the fantasy world inhabited by reporters when they write about the finances of the revolutionary left. Next note. Clear Out Hitler's Agents was the title of a pamphlet on Trotskyism by William Wainwright, published by the Communist Party of Great Britain in 1942. New note. It is claimed that, quote, 9 out of 10 members of the Revolutionary Communist Party in 1946 were blue-collar working class, end quote. Bornstein and Richardson, War in the International, London, 1986. At the time of writing, this does not appear among Mandel's works on the Marxist Internet Archive. The question of equal pay for women had been raised in the Revolutionary Communist Party in 1945. Note also Cliff's comment in an article on Women in the USSR, Socialist Appeal, mid-July 1947, quote, the degree of humanity's progress is measured by the condition of women, end quote. In 1935, between leaving the Communist Party and becoming a Trotskyist, Haston had been close to the Socialist Party of Great Britain, where he doubtless encountered the view that Russia was state capitalist. Bert Atkinson, a supporter of Shachtman, did not go along with Cliff, believing his position was, quote, abstract, end quote, and did not appeal to workers. Bornstein and Richardson are misleading when they suggest that Cliff's document merely, quote, took over and elaborated, end quote, Haston's theories. Cliff's arguments about international competition, especially through the arms race, went far beyond Jock Haston's position and raised the debates to a higher level. The most complete account of the tangled debate among Marxists about the nature of the society existing in Russia after 1917 is provided by Marcel van der Linden's Western Marxism in the Soviet Union. The bibliography, pages 331 to 374, is comprehensive. I didn't get this book from there, but I've got a lot of the things that I put on this channel from the bibliography in Marcel van der Linden's Western Marxism in the Soviet Union. New note. Lenin thus used the term in a different way from other old Bolshevik Nikolai Bukharin, for whom state capitalism was a stage in the development of imperialism in which the state organized production as a collective capitalist. New note. The comparison of the Russian economy to a single factory was developed by Cliff. New note. Ray Chalonor's late summary of this letter is rather misleading. Quote, they agreed she would devote her time to study the philosophical implications and that Cliff would look at the economic issues, end quote. Chalonor, The Perspective of the Long Haul, which is on this channel. That's from Workers' Liberty, number 21, May 1995. In the 1950s, a number of members of the SRG were influenced by James's and Dunayevskaya's ideas. See J.D. Young, Making Trouble, Glasgow, 1987, and Ray Chalonor, Tony Cliff's Early Years in Britain, Revolutionary History, 2000. In 1947, a British worker's average weekly earnings were £5, 3 shillings and sixpence. Ministry of Labour survey for British workers, April 1947, quoted in Cliff, Marxist Theory After Trotsky, Selected Writings, Volume 3. The decline of the Revolutionary Communist Party led to an increasing concentration on internal debate, though Haston was probably exaggerating when he claimed that, quote, at one stage 9/10 of our activity was spent in producing internal bulletins. Interview quoted in Bornstein and Richardson's War and International. Tony Cliff, new note, Tony Cliff, Stalinist Russia, a Marxist Analysis, 1955, Russia, a Marxist Analysis, 1964, State Capitalism in Russia, 1974, State Capitalism in Russia, 1988, Tony Cliff, Marxist Theory After Trotsky, Selected Writings, Volume 3, contains the original document. Next note. In the conclusion to his comprehensive study of Marxist theories of post-revolutionary Russia, Marcel van der Linden writes, quote, in fact, only two representatives of the state capitalism theory took an approach compatible with an orthodox definition of capitalism, Cliff and Bettelheim. Both assumed the existence of a bourgeoisie in the Soviet Union and both believed that competition existed. Bettelheim believed this competition existed in the domestic economy, while Cliff believed he could identify it at the international level. Quote, Cliff's approach forced him to reduce competition essentially to the arms race, a competition over military capacity. That, however, is still in conflict with orthodoxy. The arms race, after all, did not involve mainly commodities produced for an open market and therefore cannot be considered as trade based on capitalist competition, ... Ultimately, we are forced to the conclusion that not a single theory of state capitalism succeeded in being both orthodox Marxist as well as consistent with the facts, end quote. Marcel van der Linden, Western Marxism and the Soviet Union. This is less than fair to Cliff to insist as he did that accumulation was driven by competition was retaining an essential theme in Marxism. To abandon that would mean departing from the very core of the Marxist analysis, but to observe that in the 20th century competition might take forms never envisaged by Marx was a simple recognition of the facts. The combination of the essential tenets of Marxism with an acceptance of the changing nature of reality was at the very heart of Cliff's method. New note, quote, it would therefore be a piece of monstrous nonsense to split with comrades who on the question of the sociological nature of the USSR have an opinion different from ours insofar as they solidarize with us in regard to the political tasks, end quote. That's true, but that may be true, but the political tasks that fell out of these different theories I think is pretty tremendous. I think that the bureaucratic collectivist theory, which was kind of in its infancy at this time, that was being put forward mostly by James Burnham, at this point, and then later adopted after the split in the Socialist Workers Party that formed the Workers Party with between under the leadership of Max Shachtman. The USSR, as a worker state, put a serious premium on the unconditional defense of the USSR. And to my understanding, the split between the Socialist Workers Party and the Workers Party, or the majority that would become the Socialist Workers Party and the minority that would become the Workers Party, the main point of contention was whether or not to support the Soviet Union in its expansionist foreign policy, right? So, okay, there's defense of the Soviet Union, which, which is kind of like a banality. Like, of course, you could say that whatever you think about Stalinism, you think it would be bad for the country to be invaded by a foreign power, right, or something like that, or be destroyed by a foreign power. That would be bad, right? Perhaps not. Maybe bad for different reasons. The Trotskyists would think it would be bad because it was, hurting the worker state or something like that. But they fundamentally split about how to regard events in Finland and Poland. And I think that the certain attitudes towards Stalinism and the degree of its reactionary character highly influenced the positions people took on that debate, even if they weren't theoretically fleshed out. But maybe I'll revise that opinion as I read more of the secondary literature on this topic, but that's my feeling as of now. Anyway, back to these notes. New note, Cliff did not generally make sectarian remarks in public speeches or writings, but I recall in around 1969 he told me with great glee, quote, we are now 4 Fourth Internationals, end quote. Quote, there are now 4 Fourth Internationals, end quote. New note. To be technically accurate, these were, quote, deformed rather than, quote, degenerated worker states, since unlike Russia, they had never been healthy worker states in the first place. New section. For a full account of Healy's role, see B. Pitt, The Rise and Fall of Jerry Healy. New note. The special branch officer who wrote the report, Sergeant W. Jones, had observed the Congress from the, quote, vicinity, end quote, though he claimed to have heard, quote, much of what transpired, end quote. That Jones did not know as much as he wanted his superiors to believe he did is shown by the bizarre claim that Cliff, quote, is now believed to be identical with Charles Van Gelderen, end quote. New note. In 1941, the Dublin branch of the Communist Party of Ireland, the only surviving branch in the South, had dissolved and its members had joined the Labour Party as individuals. New note. This was not the notorious, quote, Jewish doctors plot, end quote, denounced in 1953. From the late 1940s, many Jewish doctors, intellectuals, and other professionals were sacked or imprisoned. New note. Though hostile to the theory of bureaucratic collectivism, Cliff recognized Shachtman's strengths. When he heard of Shachtman's death in 1972, he expressed regret for liking for Shachtman. He expressed regret and liking for Shachtman. One of the things that Alan Johnson says is that, there's more in common between the state capitalist thesis of the Soviet Union and the bureaucratic collectivist thesis of the Soviet Union. They have more in common with each other by a country mile than do degenerated worker state thesis people and these two that broke with Trotsky on this question. And in fact, it kind of is represented by the brief, discussions with each other between the Independent Socialist League. It might have been the Independent Socialist Clubs by this point, which are headed by people like Hal Draper, and the International Socialists headed by Cliff. There was an exchange of some kind that was talked about, I believe, earlier in this piece. But I'm kind of reading this in staggered notes, so I haven't been. I have to re-listen to myself talking about this to really get a full round share of what I'm talking about. But final note, I think. Yes. Doubtless Cliff was thinking of those in the Fourth International who were arguing that Tito was a, quote, unconscious Trotskyist, end quote. In the discussion in the Revolutionary Communist Party that followed the publication of Cliff's 1948 document, David James had argued that, quote, objectively it is Tito and Gomulka and perhaps even Tamar Mao Zedong who expressed this is the program of Trotskyism unconsciously in a distorted form, end quote. See Bornstein and Richardson, War in the International, London, published in London, 1986. It might be malicious to suggest that the only, quote, unconscious Trotskyists, end quote, were those who entered the Labour Party and fallen asleep at their ward meetings.